Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're settling into a question that is a little strange, a little personal, and quietly present in every human life. Why do you forget most of it? It is odd when you stop and look at it plainly. You have lived through thousands of ordinary mornings, countless meals, passing conversations, long afternoons, small disappointments, funny little accidents, and entire seasons of your own life that once felt immediate and real. Yet so much of it is gone. Not hidden neatly on a shelf, not resting in perfect order somewhere deep in the mind, but simply unavailable, as if whole portions of life were written in water instead of ink. And before we wander further into that mystery, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what kind of hour it is in your part of the world. If you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a pleasant way to unwind at the end of the day, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner reach other people who might need a calm place to think and rest. Now, I should warn you, this subject has a way of making a person pause and look backward into the attic of their own life, but that is all right. We will take it gently. So settle in. Let your thoughts loosen a little. And let us begin with the uncomfortable and very human truth that most of what you live does not stay with you for long. At first, that sounds almost tragic. You might hear it and think, surely not most of it. Surely the mind does a better job than that. After all, your life feels full. It feels continuous. You wake each day with a sense that you're the same person who has been moving through all those previous years, carrying the story forward. There is a deep impression of possession, as if your past belongs to you in a rich and accessible way. But if someone asked you to describe, in detail, what you had for lunch on a Tuesday 3 years ago, or what shirt you were wearing on an average afternoon in autumn, or the exact words spoken during a forgettable bus ride when you were 17, you would likely find nothing at all, not even a faint outline. Vast stretches of existence pass through us with almost no lasting record. This is not because your brain is lazy, broken, careless, or ungrateful. In fact, the opposite is closer to the truth. You forget so much because your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is not a museum trying to preserve every object behind glass. It is not a security camera recording everything in faithful detail. And it is certainly not a flawless archive that stores each second of life in complete and permanent form. The brain is a living system that must make decisions, constantly, about what matters now, what might matter later, and what can be safely allowed to fade. In other words, forgetting is not a design flaw. It is part of the design. That can feel slightly offensive at first. We like to imagine that our minds are respectful keepers of our experience, carefully storing what we have lived through because, after all, it was our life. But the brain has a different job. Its first priority is not honouring the emotional dignity of every moment. Its first priority is helping you survive, adapt, learn, decide, and function in a world that produces far too much information for any creature to hold in full detail. Every second, your senses are bombarded with more input than conscious awareness could ever handle. Light, sound, temperature, pressure, movement, language, faces, background noise, internal body signals, remembered concerns, possible future actions. It is an avalanche. If your brain tried to preserve everything equally, it would become buried in useless detail. Imagine for a moment that you did remember everything. Not just the important landmarks, but every glance at a wall, every meaningless sound in a supermarket, every moment your hand reached for a doorknob, every patch of pavement, every face you passed without speaking to, every slight shift in posture while waiting in line. Life would not become richer, it would become unbearable. Thought would slow under the weight of excess. Decision-making would clog with irrelevant clutter. Instead of extracting meaning, you would drown in raw material. There are rare cases of people with unusually powerful autobiographical memory, and while this may sound like a gift, it often comes with real burdens. To remember too much is not always freeing. It can trap people in detail, in replay, in emotional residue. It can make old embarrassments feel present, old griefs harder to soften, and the ordinary process of moving forward more complicated. The ability to let experience settle, simplify, and in many cases disappear is one of the quiet mercies of a healthy mind. Still, there is something eerie about how much goes missing. Think of childhood. Most adults remember childhood as a scattered set of islands in a very large sea. A kitchen, a bicycle, a smell, a day at school, a relative's voice, a fragment of fear, a birthday cake, a hallway at dusk. Yet the actual lived childhood was enormous. It stretched across years filled with almost constant novelty. There were whole months that, at the time, felt complete and immediate, and now they have vanished so thoroughly that it is difficult even to feel their absence. We do not usually walk around grieving this because forgetting feels normal. But if you stop to consider it, it is one of the strangest things about being human. You can fully live an event and later lose nearly all access to it. Part of what makes this strange is that memory feels, from the inside, like storage. We speak as if memories are things placed somewhere. We say we have them, lose them, retrieve them, bury them, unlock them. This language makes the mind sound like a building with shelves and drawers, but memory is not really like that. It is not a static object kept unchanged over time. It is an active biological process, and one that depends on many steps going right. First, something must be noticed. Then it must be processed in a way that gives it enough importance to be encoded. Then it must be stabilized, linked with other information, and later retrieved through the right cues and contexts. Failure can happen at any stage. Sometimes the moment was never truly encoded. Sometimes it was weakly formed. Sometimes it was altered. Sometimes it still exists in some buried and partial form but cannot be reached. The result, from your perspective, is simple. It feels forgotten. This is why forgetting often begins long before you realize it has happened. You may assume that because you experienced something consciously, it entered memory properly. But awareness is not the same as storage. Much of life passes through consciousness lightly, without being deeply marked. You can watch someone tell you their name and then forget it within seconds, not because names are impossible to remember, but because attention was divided, importance was low, and the trace never settled strongly enough to last. You can drive home on a route you know well and later remember almost none of the trip because your mind was occupied elsewhere, and the road required little fresh processing. The body was present, the eyes were open, but the experience left almost no durable record. That idea alone explains a surprising amount of life. Many things are forgotten not because they were once stored and later erased, but because they were never truly built into lasting memory to begin with. The brain is constantly filtering. It assumes, often correctly, that repetition, routine, and low emotional relevance do not require precious storage space. If every breakfast looks similar, and every commute followed the same pattern, then preserving each one in detail offers little benefit. What matters more is the pattern extracted from them. The brain would rather keep the gist than the exact footage. This preference for gist over detail shapes how we remember nearly everything. You do not typically remember every conversation with a friend. You remember what the friendship is like. You do not retain every meal from last winter. You retain a broader sense of what that period of life felt like, where you lived, whether you were stressed, lonely, excited, busy, or content. The exact moments fall away, and in their place the mind builds a compressed model. This is efficient. It allows you to understand your life without carrying every frame, but it also creates the strange situation in which you feel you remember a period clearly, while actually possessing only a handful of specific scenes and a broad emotional summary. That may be one reason life can seem both long and short at the same time. Long when you consider how much has happened. Short when you try to grasp the actual texture of it. So many days were fully lived, and yet they no longer exist in detail inside you. There is a kind of compression taking place all the time. The mind edits, condenses, smooths. It trims repetition, retains what was useful, highlights what was novel or emotionally charged, and lets the rest dissolve. Emotion, of course, changes the picture. Some moments stay because they strike hard. Fear, joy, humiliation, grief, love, surprise. These states tell the brain that something significant is happening. Hormones and attention sharpen. The event becomes more likely to be marked as important. This is why people can often remember where they were during a shocking event, or exactly how a room looked during a painful conversation, or the feeling of hearing certain news for the first time. Strong emotion can act like a signal flare. It tells the nervous system not to treat this as background. But even here, memory is not perfect. Emotional memories may feel vivid, and vividness can create confidence. But confidence is not the same as accuracy. A memory can feel bright and certain while still being incomplete, reshaped, simplified, or subtly rewritten. The brain is not keeping a clean recording. It is reconstructing each time from traces, and each reconstruction is influenced by later thoughts, later feelings, later interpretations. This means that even the parts of life we do keep are not always kept exactly as they happened. They are living reconstructions, updated across time. That can sound unsettling, but it is also deeply practical. A brain that stores only rigid records would be less flexible than one that updates meaning. Human memory is built not just to preserve the past, but to serve the present. It helps you predict, navigate, avoid danger, maintain relationships, and build a coherent sense of self. In that sense, memory is less like a diary and more like a working model. It is selective because usefulness matters more than completeness. One of the quietest examples of this is how quickly ordinary days disappear. Yesterday may still feel reachable, last week perhaps as well. But go back a month or a year, and the number of fully recoverable days shrinks drastically. Most are gone. Not because they were unimportant in any moral sense, but because they did not differ enough from neighbouring days, did not demand enough attention, or did not attach themselves to strong enough cues. They blended. The brain, seeing no urgent reason to keep each one distinct, allowed them to merge into a general impression. This is why novelty often feels memorable. A trip to a new place, the first day at a job, moving house, a sudden event, a new relationship, a frightening accident. Novelty tells the brain that the world has changed, and that detailed encoding might be useful. A new environment requires learning. New people require tracking. New risks require caution. The brain responds by paying closer attention, laying down stronger traces, and later giving you the feeling that those periods were fuller, longer, more detailed. Routine does the opposite. It allows the system to automate, to save energy, to stop recording the familiar in detail. In a way, forgetting is the price of efficiency. To function well, the brain must turn repeated experience into habits, summaries, expectations, and shortcuts. If every step of brushing your teeth required fresh conscious attention and strong long-term storage, daily life would be exhausting. Instead, much of living becomes procedural and compressed. This helps you act smoothly, but it also means fewer memorable markers. You did the thing, but the doing did not need to become an enduring story. There is another reason forgetting matters, and it has to do with identity. It may seem that remembering everything would make the self stronger, but the self depends partly on selection. You're not simply the sum of all moments equally preserved. You're a narrative creature, and narratives require emphasis. Some events become central, others peripheral. Some are treated as turning points, others as texture. This is not dishonest. It is how a mind organizes a life into something workable. Without selection, there would be no shape. There would only be accumulation. That shape is one reason two people can live through the same event and remember it very differently. Their attention differed. Their emotional states differed. Their expectations differed, their later retellings differed. Each brain asked its own practical question, what matters here? And from that question came a different memory. This means forgetting is not just about loss, it is also about perspective. What you keep says something about what your mind was trying to do. Sometimes that selection can be painful. We may wish we remembered more of those who are gone, more of a particular house, more of a period that once felt precious. We may find that the face of a grandparent has become less clear than expected, or that a year once central to us now survives only as a few disconnected scenes. This can feel like betrayal, as if the mind has failed to honour what mattered. But memory is not governed by sentiment alone. Love does not guarantee detail. Importance in the heart is not always enough to preserve exact recall in the brain. That is one reason photographs, journals, songs, smells and objects can feel so powerful. They lend the mind a cue, a handle, a way back toward what was slipping. And even then the return is often incomplete. A photograph may awaken a feeling without restoring the full day. A smell may bring a room to life, but not the conversation that happened in it. Memory rarely opens like a vault. More often, it arrives in flashes, patches, and softened edges. The remarkable thing is not that this happens occasionally. The remarkable thing is that this is the normal structure of a remembered life. So when we ask why you forget most of your life, the answer is beginning to take shape. You forget because the brain is selective, because attention is limited, because storage is biological, not magical, because routine is compressed, because usefulness outranks completeness, because memory is built for adaptation, not preservation, because detail fades unless reinforced, because even what remains is reconstructed rather than replayed, and perhaps most importantly, you forget because living requires it. To move through the world, you must be able to extract patterns rather than hoard moments. You must know what kind of person someone is without replaying every encounter. You must remember how to cross a street without recalling every street you have crossed. You must carry lessons forward while allowing raw footage to fall away. A mind that never forgot would struggle to think clearly. It would have too many doors open at once. That may not make the vanishing easier to accept, but it does make it less mysterious. What disappears is not proof that life was unreal or wasted. It is proof that the mind was doing triage, editing the flood into something manageable. And yet this raises another question, one even more important than the first. If the brain is always selecting, then what decides what gets through in the first place? Why does one moment stick while another vanishes before the day is done? Why does one sentence stay for decades while an entire afternoon dissolves by evening? To answer that, we have to move closer to the narrow gate through which experience first becomes memory at all, because before the brain can keep anything, it has to notice it. There is a quiet decision happening in your mind almost every second of your life, and most of the time you never notice it. The world arrives in far greater detail than you could ever consciously hold, and somewhere between your eyes and your memory, between sensation and meaning, the brain begins sorting. Not everything is invited in. Not everything is given a seat. Most of what reaches you is handled briefly, judged quickly, and then allowed to pass. This is the first filter, and without it, life would not become richer. It would become impossible to manage. At first, that may sound a little unfair. After all, this is your life. These are your moments. If you are the one living them, should your brain not keep a more generous record? But the brain does not think in terms of fairness. It thinks in terms of usefulness, efficiency, relevance, and survival. It is less like an admirer trying to preserve every petal of experience and more like a practical editor sitting at a desk under terrible deadline pressure, muttering, "No, no, no, maybe, absolutely not, perhaps, keep that, throw this away." If it sounds slightly ruthless, that is because it is. It has to be. The amount of information flowing into your nervous system at any given moment is staggering. Light enters the eyes in constantly shifting patterns. Sound reaches the ears from every direction. Skin feels temperature, pressure, and movement. The nose samples the air. The body reports hunger, balance, pain, muscle tension, heartbeat, and position. At the same time, the brain is also dealing with inner activity. Thoughts, predictions, worries, habits, plans, memories, language, associations, and emotional signals are all moving across the system. It is not a gentle trickle, it is a flood. If every scrap of that flood were treated as equally important, conscious life would collapse into noise. So the brain filters. It begins filtering before you're aware of it, and it never really stops. This filtering is not one single process done in one single place. It is the coordinated work of many systems, each doing its own small part in deciding what deserves further processing and what does not. Some incoming information is handled so quickly and so automatically that it never rises into conscious notice at all. Other things reach awareness but disappear almost immediately. Only a small fraction is given the kind of priority that might allow it to become an enduring memory. This is worth pausing over because we often imagine that memory begins after experience, as though first we fully experience a moment and then later decide whether or not to store it. But in truth, the filtering begins much earlier. By the time something feels like a complete conscious experience, it has already survived several layers of selection. Even awareness itself is selective. You are never taking in all of reality around you. You are living inside a managed version of it. A simple example makes this easier to see. Imagine you're sitting in a quiet room reading. For several minutes, perhaps longer, you do not notice the faint hum of an appliance in the background. Then someone mentions it, or the appliance suddenly turns off, and all at once you become aware that it had been there the whole time. The sound was reaching your ears. The auditory system was processing it. But your conscious mind had decided, wisely, that this information did not matter enough to highlight. The moment it changed, or the moment attention was redirected toward it, the filter shifted. Now it mattered. This happens constantly. We ignore the feeling of our clothing on our skin until something about it becomes uncomfortable. We stop noticing a smell after a few minutes in the same environment. We can pass by dozens of faces in a day and not register any of them in lasting detail. We can hear words spoken near us without really processing their content because they were judged irrelevant. The first filter is always asking a basic question. Does this require resources? If the answer is no, the system moves on. One of the reasons the brain must work this way is that attention is expensive. Not expensive in money, which would make the whole matter far more dramatic, but in energy, time, and processing power. To attend closely to something is to allocate mental resources to it. It means slowing down enough to perceive structure, meaning, relation, novelty, possible consequences. That cannot be done for everything at once. So attention has to be selective, and memory follows where attention goes. This is why people so often fail to remember things they are sure they experienced. They did experience them in a loose and passing sense, but they did not attend to them with enough depth for the moment to be marked strongly. You may walk into a room, set down your keys while thinking about an email, and moments later have no idea where they are. The keys were real, the action happened, but attention was occupied elsewhere. The brain did not judge the placing of the keys as important enough to encode deeply. The event slipped through the net almost as soon as it occurred. That can be frustrating, but it reveals an important truth. The first filter is not especially interested in giving you a cinematic record of your day. It is interested in helping you function. If you are preoccupied with something urgent, the placement of the keys may genuinely have ranked low in relevance at that moment. The brain made a trade. It devoted resources to one stream of processing and neglected another. These trades happen all day long, and memory is shaped by them. Novelty is one of the strongest signals that pushes something through the filter. When something differs from expectation, the brain pays more attention, a strange sound in the night. an unusual face in a familiar crowd, a sentence that lands differently than expected, a sudden pain, a surprising kindness. Anything that disrupts routine gets flagged more aggressively because novelty may signal opportunity or danger. Both matter. A familiar day full of predictable actions can pass with relatively little detailed storage because the brain has seen the pattern before. But a new situation demands more careful processing. This is part of why childhood can feel, in retrospect, both vivid and lost. Children live in a world that is far more novel than the adult world. So much is being encountered for the first time. New rules, new words, new places, new social signals, new risks. The filter has reason to open wider because the environment is less known and the brain is still building models of how reality works. Yet at the same time, many early experiences do not become stable, autobiographical memories in the adult sense, because the systems needed for mature, lasting self-narrative memory are still developing. So childhood is full of experience but uneven in what survives. Routine has the opposite effect. Once the brain knows what to expect, it begins compressing. This is efficient. You do not need to freshly encode every cup of tea, every stair climbed in your own home, every stoplight on the road to work, every ordinary glance at the kitchen sink. If you did, daily life would swell into absurd detail. Instead, the brain stores the pattern. It keeps enough to guide behavior but trims the repetitive. This makes life manageable, but it also means that repeated days leave fewer distinct traces behind. Emotion is another major factor in the first filter. Strong feeling does not guarantee perfect memory, but it does increase the chance that something will be treated as important. Fear, joy, shame, grief, excitement, desire, relief. These states tell the brain that what is happening may matter beyond the immediate moment. Hormones and attention sharpen. Perception narrows. The event is more likely to be encoded with force. That is why emotionally charged experiences can remain vivid for years, while neutral, ordinary hours vanish without protest. Still, it is important not to over-romanticize emotional memory. Strong feeling can help an event get through the filter, but what is remembered may not be complete or accurate in every detail. People often remember the emotional core of a moment more reliably than its exact sequence, wording, or peripheral facts. In other words, the filter may preserve the significance while letting the edges blur. The brain is often more concerned with the meaning of a moment than with preserving it as if it were evidence in a courtroom. Relevance to goals also shapes what passes through. If you are shopping for a particular coat, you suddenly notice coats everywhere. If you are worried about a symptom, your attention becomes sensitive to body sensations that usually go unnoticed. If you are learning a new language, certain words begin to stand out in conversation or on signs. The world has not changed. Your filter has. What matters to the brain now receives enhanced processing, which increases the chance that it will be noticed, remembered, and linked to future thought. This goal-directed quality of attention is one reason memory can feel so personal. Two people can move through the same place and emerge with different recollections because they were looking for different things. One notices architecture, another notices faces, one hears tone of voice, another hears content, one is preoccupied by hunger, another by embarrassment. Their first filters are tuned differently in that moment. The environment is shared, but the mental entry points are not. There is also the matter of threat. Brains are not neutral collectors of information. They are biased, quite sensibly, toward what might harm or help survival. A sudden movement at the edge of vision, a harsh tone in someone's voice, a sign of social rejection, a possible source of pain, a hint of danger in the environment. These things can move through the filter rapidly because missing them may be costly. This does not mean the brain is always calm and rational about threat, sadly. It can be overprotective, anxious, or too quick to sound the alarm. But from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that attention would be biased toward the negative. Better to notice one harmless rustle in the bushes too many than one predator too few. That survival bias helps explain why unpleasant moments can stick so stubbornly. A social embarrassment, a sharp criticism, a frightening event, even a small failure can sometimes receive more mental weight than dozens of neutral or pleasant experiences. The filter has been shaped by a long history in which negative surprises often carried more immediate consequences than positive ones. This is not always emotionally convenient, but it is biologically understandable. The first filter also depends on state. Your brain does not process the world identically when rested, exhausted, hungry, ill, relaxed, overwhelmed, or distracted. A tired brain is less efficient at careful encoding. A stressed brain may narrow its focus to whatever seems urgent, letting other details go unmarked. A calm and attentive state often allows richer processing. This is one reason the same environment can feel memorable on one day and forgettable on another. You are not the same processor each time. Think of the difference between walking through a park on a quiet morning when your mind is open and rushing through the same park while late and anxious. In the first case, you may notice the shape of the trees, the chill in the air, the dog shaking water from its coat, the texture of light on the path. In the second, you may remember almost nothing except the feeling of urgency. The world did not fail to present itself. Your filter simply had other priorities. This is also why multitasking is often such a memory thief. People like to imagine they are doing several things at once with elegant modern efficiency, but what is usually happening is rapid switching between tasks, each switch costing attention. When attention is split, encoding weakens. You may think you listened to the conversation while checking your phone, or followed the instructions while planning dinner, but the memory formed under those conditions is often thin. The first filter did not fully commit to the moment, so the moment did not fully stay. There is a slightly humbling lesson in that. A great many forgettable experiences are not really failures of storage. They are failures of entry. They did not receive enough sustained attention, novelty, emotional force, or relevance to pass strongly through the filter at all. What feels later, like loss, may, in part, be the natural consequence of not truly having let the moment in to begin with. Yet this should not be taken as an accusation. No one can live in full, focused presence every second. That would be exhausting and rather impractical if you ever wish to perform a dull task without turning it into a philosophical ceremony. The brain needs to automate. It needs to skim. It needs to let some things blur so that more important functions can proceed. The first filter is not proof that we are careless with our lives. It is proof that a living mind must prioritize. Working memory plays a crucial role here. This is the mental space where information is briefly held and manipulated. The place where you keep a phone number long enough to dial it, or hold the start of a sentence in mind while processing the end. Working memory is limited. Very limited. That limit forces the brain to choose what remains active for the next few seconds and what falls away. If something does not get rehearsed, linked, or given greater significance, it often disappears quickly. This is not a dramatic deletion. It is more like a brief chalk mark washed off by the next wave. That briefness is easy to underestimate. We tend to think that once something enters awareness, it should remain accessible for a while. But many impressions have an extremely short life, unless reinforced. A name heard once and not repeated. A detail glanced at without comment. A thought interrupted by something louder. A plan formed while walking through a doorway and then lost upon arrival. These are ordinary examples of the first filter and its close companions deciding that the information does not deserve extended holding. Context matters too. The brain encodes more effectively when new information can be connected to something already meaningful. A fact attached to a strong image, a story, a familiar framework, or personal relevance will often pass through more successfully than a floating fact with no anchor. This is why good teachers do more than deliver information. They connect it, shape it, give it texture. Connection helps information survive the filter. It also explains why we remember conversations differently depending on whether they mattered to us. An offhand remark may disappear by evening, while a single sentence spoken at the right time can remain for decades. The words themselves may not have been objectively grander, but they found an entry point. They attached to fear, hope, identity, desire, or surprise. The filter recognized that the sentence belonged to something larger than itself. There is, beneath all of this, a useful and slightly sobering truth. You're not only living your life, you're continually editing it in real time, and much of that editing happens before you know it. The first filter decides what gets enough attention to have a chance of becoming part of your remembered world. It is shaping the rough draft of your inner history moment by moment. Most of the time it does this wisely. Sometimes it does it imperfectly. Either way, it is always at work. This can make the remembered self feel narrower than the lived self. The version of your life available to memory is only a fraction of the whole, not because the rest was unreal, but because the first filter allowed only certain moments to cross the threshold with enough force to remain. The rest still influenced you. They shaped mood, habits, expectations, body states, preferences, and subtle learning. They mattered even if they were not preserved as clear stories. Much of life changes you without staying visible. That may be one of the strangest features of memory. We assume that what we remember best shaped us most, but that is not always true. Repeated tiny experiences, ordinary routines, unnoticed tensions, familiar kindnesses, daily environments, all of these can sculpt a person without leaving behind crisp autobiographical scenes. The first filter may have let them pass without fanfare, yet their cumulative effect remains in behaviour and feeling. In that sense, forgetting does not mean absence of influence. It only means absence of retrievable detail. So when the brain fails to keep everything, it is not being negligent. It is making triage decisions in a world too full to capture whole. It is preserving what seems most worth the cost and letting the rest support life quietly from the background. This is the first filter, not a cruel gatekeeper, but a necessary one, deciding again and again what will be highlighted, what will be compressed, and what will vanish almost as soon as it appears. And once something has passed that first gate, another question begins. It is one thing for a moment to be noticed. It is another thing for it to be held, strengthened, and built into something that can last. Because attention opens the door, but attention alone is not enough. What enters must still be shaped into memory, and that shaping turns out to depend on an even more delicate and surprisingly fragile process. There is a popular idea that memory works a little like a camera. You point your mind at the world, something happens in front of you, and a copy of that moment is taken and filed away somewhere inside. Later, if all goes well, you return to the file and pull it out. It is a simple idea, a comforting one, and almost completely wrong. Memory is not created by mere exposure. It is not enough for something to happen in front of you. It is not even enough for you to be physically present while it happens. For a moment to have a real chance of becoming part of your lasting inner life, it usually has to pass through a narrow and demanding gate, and that gate is attention. Attention is one of those mental processes that seems ordinary until you look closely at it. Then it starts to seem almost magical, or at least suspiciously important for something we usually take for granted. It is the act of selecting from the flood. It is the difference between a sound being merely audible and actually heard, between a face being visible and actually noticed, between a sentence passing by and a sentence landing. Without attention, the world still reaches your senses, but it does not arrive in the same meaningful way. It brushes past, it leaves lighter traces, often it never stays at all. This is why people can so easily confuse experience with memory. They assume that because they were there, the moment has been secured. But being there is not the same as attending. You can sit through an entire conversation while your mind is elsewhere and retain almost none of it. You can walk through a familiar street and later realize you remember nothing about the journey. You can read the same paragraph 3 times because your eyes moved across the words but your attention did not truly join them. In each case, perception happened in some basic sense, but attention did not fully open the gate. Very little got in. That can sound discouraging, but it is really just a sign of how selective the mind must be. Attention is limited. It cannot embrace everything at once. It has to choose, constantly, among sights, sounds, thoughts, emotions, tasks, and memories competing for priority. This competition is happening all the time, even now. The pressure of a chair, the temperature of the room, a distant sound outside, the meaning of these words, whatever thought has been hovering in the edge of your mind for the last few minutes. Your brain is deciding what to highlight and what to dim. That decision shapes not only what you know in the moment, but what you may later remember. One of the easiest ways to see this is through the ordinary embarrassment of forgetting names. Someone is introduced to you at a gathering, you hear the name, you may even repeat it politely. 10 seconds later, it is gone, and you're left standing there hoping no direct address will be required. This happens so often that people sometimes think they must be especially bad with names. Sometimes they are, but often the problem is more basic. The name never got enough attention at the point of entry. Perhaps you were thinking about your own introduction, wondering what to say next, noticing the room, managing self-consciousness, or trying to remember whether you had met this person before. The sound of the name passed through awareness, but attention was divided. The gate was only half open. The memory trace formed weakly, and weak traces disappear fast. Attention is not simply about looking hard at something. It is about the allocation of mental resources. It is the process by which the brain says, "This matters for now." It can be directed deliberately, as when you focus on solving a problem or listening closely to a friend. It can also be captured automatically, as when a loud noise, a flash of movement, or a sudden pain pulls your mind without permission. Both forms matter. Voluntary attention helps build memory through effort and intention. Involuntary attention helps memory by flagging events that may be important for survival or immediate response. This dual nature of attention explains a good deal about what gets remembered. Things you deliberately study, repeat, compare, and reflect on have a greater chance of staying because you are giving them sustained processing. Things that seize your attention suddenly through shock, fear, novelty, or strong emotion can also stay because the brain treats them as significant. What tends not to stay is everything in between. The lightly noticed, the routine, the half-heard, the glanced at, the mentally crowded out. That middle territory is enormous. In fact, most of life lives there. A great many moments are not emotionally intense enough to grab us and not intentionally focused on enough to be deeply encoded. They are ordinary. They pass through a mind busy with other concerns. We notice them just enough to navigate, but not enough to keep. This is one reason so much of life becomes difficult to retrieve later. Not because the world withheld itself from us, but because attention was thin, fragmented, or elsewhere. Modern life is especially good at scattering attention. It is rather gifted at it, really. Notifications, screens, multiple conversations, internal planning, background audio, rushing, multitasking, low-level anxiety, the steady habit of checking one thing while doing another. Many people now spend large portions of the day with attention in a state of constant interruption. The result is not simply fatigue. It is often shallow encoding. Moments are experienced in pieces, with frequent cuts in focus. What enters memory under those conditions is often weaker, more fragmented, and less stable. This is not only a matter of external distraction. Internal distraction matters just as much, and sometimes more. A person can sit in perfect silence and still fail to attend because the mind is crowded with worry, rumination, anticipation, irritation, fantasy, or mental rehearsal. Anyone who has ever driven somewhere while replaying an argument in their head knows this feeling. You arrive safely, which is fortunate and speaks well of habit and procedural memory, but the journey itself is almost absent from recollection. Your eyes did their part. Your hands did their part. Your attention, however, was busy staging a private courtroom drama. The road never had much chance. Attention also has a depth to it, and this depth matters more than we might think. It is possible to attend to something in a shallow way, just enough to identify it, and to attend in a deeper way that links it with meaning, context, feeling, and existing knowledge. These are not the same. Shallow attention might allow you to register that someone said a fact. Deep attention allows you to connect the fact to something else, compare it, question it, imagine it, and thereby strengthen it. Memory is much more likely to retain what has been processed deeply than what has only been skimmed. This is why students often discover, to their sorrow, that reading the same notes again and again is not the same as learning them. Eyes passing over information is not enough. Attention has to work with the material. It has to engage, ask what it means, attach it to something already known, use it, rephrase it, test it. The same is true outside school. A day lived in superficial, divided awareness tends to leave behind a weaker memory than a day in which moments were truly met and mentally handled. There is a famous and slightly unsettling demonstration of how selective attention can be. In experiments on inattentional blindness, people are asked to focus on one task, such as counting ball passes between players, and while doing so, they fail to notice something startlingly obvious, like a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. It sounds absurd until you remember how often it happens in ordinary life. When attention is tightly aimed at one target, other information, even highly visible information, may barely register. The eyes may see, the brain may process enough to guide movement, but the conscious mind never fully admits the event. Later, people are astonished that they missed it. This tells us something profound and slightly unnerving. Attention does not merely enhance memory, it helps determine what becomes part of conscious experience in the first place. If attention is elsewhere, whole elements of reality may fail to enter the kind of awareness that can later be recalled. This means memory loss often begins not after the fact, but in the very structure of the moment. What never received real attention often never had a fair chance. That helps explain why emotionally loaded periods can feel odd in retrospect. During stress, grief, or exhaustion, people often report that time becomes blurry. Days were lived, but not well remembered. Conversations happened, but details vanished. This is not because stress always sharpens memory in a useful way. Sometimes stress narrows attention so much that only a few central concerns get through, while everything else is neglected. The brain becomes preoccupied with threat, urgency, or emotional survival. Peripheral details fall away. In some circumstances, strong emotion marks a moment more intensely. In others, it crowds out broader awareness and leaves the period patchy. Depression can do something similar, though in its own style. When the mind is heavy, repetitive, and inward turned, attention often loses vitality. The world can begin to feel flat, and because attention is one of the engines that gives experience texture, memory may later reflect that flatness. An entire stretch of time can seem difficult to distinguish because fewer moments were met with active interest, novelty, or emotional variation. Anxiety too can distort attention by making it overly sensitive to certain signals and neglectful of others. The remembered life becomes shaped by what attention was allowed to see. There is something else important here. Attention is not impartial. It is guided by desire, fear, habits, expectations, identity, and current goals. It notices what seems relevant. If you are worried about rejection, you may attend more strongly to coldness, silence, or signs of disapproval. If you are newly in love, you may attend to every message, glance, and tone with embarrassing thoroughness. If you're buying a red car, suddenly red cars appear to have colonized the city. The world feels different, but in large part your attention has changed. Since memory follows attention, what you later remember will also reflect that bias. This is one reason different people can remember the same event so differently. Their attention was not aimed at the same things. One person noticed the insult. Another noticed the joke that followed. One person focused on the room, the clothing, the arrangement of objects. Another focused entirely on the emotional undercurrent. Both were present. Both may later feel certain, but each memory is built from the selected pieces attention chose to admit and emphasize. The relationship between attention and meaning is especially powerful. We tend to attend more to what we understand, and we remember better what becomes meaningful. But this relationship works in both directions. Sometimes meaning emerges because attention stayed long enough. Think of meeting a place for the first time. At first it may feel generic, hardly different from other streets or buildings. But over time, as attention returns, details accumulate. The corner shop becomes the place where something funny happened. The bench becomes associated with a conversation. The route gathers texture. Memory grows where attention has revisited and invested. Repetition alone does not guarantee memory, but repetition plus attention is potent. This is why routines can be oddly double-sided. On one hand, routine compresses memory because repeated days blur together. On the other hand, repeated attention to certain people, places and activities can create strong semantic and emotional knowledge. You may not remember every breakfast at your childhood table, but you know that table. You know what the mornings felt like there. The repeated attentional contact built a general memory structure even while individual instances vanished. This points to a subtle difference between remembering an event and knowing a pattern. Attention helps build both, but in different ways. A single striking moment may be remembered because attention was intense and focused. A repeated pattern may be known because attention returned again and again over time. The first gives you a scene, the second gives you a sense. Much of what you call memory is actually this second kind. You do not remember every moment of being around someone you loved. You carry a model of them, shaped by many attended encounters. You do not remember every evening in a former home. You retain the atmosphere. Still, individual moments matter, and they are especially vulnerable to divided attention. Consider how often people try to preserve important experiences while not fully inhabiting them. A concert watched partly through a phone screen. A holiday spent documenting, organising, checking, posting. A family dinner half shared with the remote notifications. This is not a moral lecture. It is simply a cognitive fact that attention cannot be in two places with full strength at once. When moments are split this way, the resulting memory may be thinner than expected. People are sometimes surprised to find that heavily photographed experiences are not always the most vividly remembered from the inside. The record exists externally, but internal encoding may have been weaker because attention was diluted by the act of managing the record. There is a small irony in that. We often try to protect memory by documenting, yet memory itself still depends on lived attention. A photograph can later cue recall, which is valuable, but it cannot replace the original work of the mind actually being there. Attention also changes with age and expertise. The beginner and the expert do not see the same world. A novice chess player attends to the pieces one by one. An expert sees patterns, threats, structures, possibilities. A medical student may hear a blur of details in a case presentation. An experienced clinician notices what matters and organizes it rapidly. This means that memory is shaped not just by how much attention you give, but by the kind of attention you are capable of giving. Expertise changes what the gatekeeper recognizes as important. Children offer an interesting contrast. Their attention is often more captured by novelty, vividness, and immediate reward than by deliberate long-term goals. This makes some childhood moments feel intensely present and emotionally charged, but it does not always make them durable in adult recollection. Mature autobiographical memory requires more than interest alone. It also depends on language, self-concept, narrative organisation, and brain development. So children attend deeply in some ways, but the form in which memory becomes lasting and narratively retrievable is still under construction. Sleep, though it comes later in the story of memory, is already waiting in the wings here. Attention determines what gets a chance to be encoded, but sleep helps decide what is consolidated. A moment neglected by attention is unlikely to be rescued later. Sleep cannot build a strong house from materials barely gathered. This is why a tired, distracted, poorly attended day often remains poorly remembered no matter how well you sleep afterward. The gatekeeper did not let enough in, and yet attention is not always under conscious command. This is important because people often blame themselves too harshly for what they fail to remember. They assume carelessness when the truth may be fatigue, overload, illness, stress, trauma, or the simple limits of human cognitive architecture. The brain cannot attend fully to everything. It was never built to. Attention has blind spots, bottlenecks, moments of drift, and patterns shaped by biology and circumstance. Forgetting is sometimes the consequence of those limits, not a character flaw. Even so, the quality of attention does shape the quality of a remembered life. This does not mean every moment should be lived with intense scrutiny, as if one were trying to mentally preserve a museum exhibit. That would be exhausting and slightly unnerving company for everyone around you, but it does mean that what is attended becomes more available to memory, and what is never truly attended often disappears with astonishing speed. The gatekeeper is not sentimental. It responds to focus, relevance, emotion, novelty, and mental state. There is something almost tender in realizing this. So many things we later wish we had kept more clearly were not lost because they lacked worth, but because attention at the time was elsewhere. We were tired, young, preoccupied, hurried. We assumed there would be more such moments. We did not know the afternoon was one of the last in that house, or that the voice we were half listening to would one day be gone, or that the ordinary walk would later seem precious. Attention is often strongest when importance is known, but life rarely tells us in advance which moments will become sacred later. That uncertainty is part of being human. We attend imperfectly because we live forward, not backward. We do not know in real time what the future self will grieve, treasure, or long to revisit. The gatekeeper makes its decisions under ordinary conditions with incomplete knowledge. Sometimes it chooses wisely. Sometimes it lets beauty pass because the moment wore the clothing of routine. Sometimes it misses significance because significance had not yet announced itself. Still, attention is one of the few ways experience deepens into something more likely to stay. To truly look, truly listen, truly inhabit a moment, not with strain but with presence, is to improve its odds, not guarantee them, but improve them. Attention tells the brain, this is not just passing noise. This matters enough to process. It is the act by which the raw material of life is offered a chance at becoming memory, and even then, not everything that enters will remain. Attention opens the door, but what comes through is still fragile. Some traces are thin, some are unstable, some are crowded out by what follows. Some need repetition, rest, emotional weight, or connection to survive the next stages. So attention is the gatekeeper, yes, but it is not the whole story. It decides much about what gets in. It does not fully decide what never leaves. For that, we have to move to the memory trace itself, that delicate first imprint, and ask how something once noticed begins to fade. There is a moment, brief and easy to miss, when something you experience begins to turn into something you might later remember. It does not look like much from the outside. There is no sound, no visible mark, no small light switching on inside your head to announce that a memory has just been created. But beneath the surface, a pattern begins to form. A set of neurons fire together in a particular way. Signals pass across tiny gaps. Chemical changes start to unfold. It is the beginning of what scientists often call a trace, a fragile imprint of an experience that, if all goes well, may grow into something more stable, and if things do not go well, it may fade so quickly that you never notice it was there at all. It helps to understand just how delicate this early stage is. When you attend to something, as we have just explored, you open the possibility of memory, but attention alone does not guarantee durability. The initial trace is weak. It is more like a sketch than a finished drawing, more like a soft impression in sand than a carving in stone. It needs support. It needs reinforcement. It needs time. Without these, it disappears with surprising speed. This is why people often have the experience of thinking they remember something, only to find that it dissolves when they try to hold on to it. You may hear a sentence, understand it, and feel that it has landed, only to discover moments later that you cannot repeat it accurately. You may notice a detail in a room, briefly think about it, and then find it gone when you try to recall it. The trace was formed, but it was not strengthened. It remained shallow, and shallow traces are easily lost. The brain is not storing experiences in a single place like files in a cabinet. Memory is distributed across networks, different aspects of an experience, the sights, sounds, meanings, emotional tones, and contextual details are processed in different regions. The hippocampus, a small but crucial structure deep in the brain, plays a central role in linking these elements together. It helps bind the pieces into something that can later be retrieved as a coherent memory. But this binding process is not instantaneous or permanent at the moment it begins. It requires consolidation. Consolidation is the process by which a fragile trace becomes more stable over time. It involves changes at the level of synapses, the connections between neurons. When certain patterns of activity are repeated or deemed important, those connections can strengthen. The pathways become easier to activate again in the future. You can think of it as a kind of biological rehearsal, though it does not always require conscious repetition. The brain itself, especially during rest and sleep, replays and reorganizes activity in ways that support this strengthening. But before we even reach consolidation, many traces are lost at the very beginning. This is not because something dramatic destroys them. It is because they were never robust enough to begin with. A trace formed under low attention, low emotional engagement, or high distraction may simply fail to stabilize. New information arrives and overwrites it. Neural activity moves on. The brain, always dealing with more input, gives priority to what seems more relevant. The earlier trace fades into the background and then disappears. Interference is one of the main reasons this happens. Memories do not exist in isolation. They are constantly being affected by what comes before and what comes after. If you learn several similar pieces of information in a short time, they can compete with one another. Names, for example, can be particularly vulnerable. Meeting 3 new people in quick succession can make it difficult to retain any of their names clearly, because each new trace interferes with the previous one. The brain struggles to keep them distinct, and without strong differentiation they blur. This kind of interference also explains why a busy day filled with many small events can leave behind fewer clear memories than a day with fewer but more distinct experiences. When moments are similar, repetitive or closely spaced, they can crowd each other out. The traces overlap. The brain may keep a general sense of what happened, but the specific details dissolve. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a natural consequence of how overlapping information is processed. Time itself plays a role in the fragility of traces. There is a pattern often described as rapid forgetting. Shortly after an experience, the probability of losing that memory is quite high. If the trace survives this early period, it becomes more stable over time. But many traces do not survive those first hours or days. They were not reinforced. They were not revisited. They did not connect strongly to existing knowledge or emotional significance. So they fade quickly, often without leaving any clear sign that they were ever there. This can feel unsettling when you consider it directly. You may realize that much of what you experienced yesterday has already been reduced to a vague impression. Not because it was unimportant in a human sense, but because it did not pass through the stages needed to become durable memory. The trace was too light, too brief, too unsupported. Emotion, as we have touched on before, can strengthen traces at the beginning. When something is emotionally charged, the brain releases chemicals that influence how memory is encoded. This can make the initial trace stronger and increase the likelihood that it will be consolidated. But even here, the story is not simple. Very intense stress can sometimes disrupt the process rather than enhance it. The brain under extreme pressure may prioritize immediate survival responses over detailed encoding. This can lead to patchy or fragmented memories of highly stressful events. So while emotion can strengthen memory, its effects depend on intensity, context, and individual differences. Repetition is another way traces become stronger. Each time you revisit a piece of information, whether by thinking about it, talking about it, or encountering it again, you give the neural pattern another chance to stabilize. The connections are reinforced. The trace becomes less fragile. This is why studying in spaced intervals is more effective than trying to absorb everything at once. It is also why conversations that return to the same themes or stories tend to leave stronger impressions. The brain is given multiple opportunities to build and reinforce the pattern, but repetition alone is not always enough. The quality of repetition matters. Passive exposure, seeing or hearing something repeatedly, without engaging with it, may not strengthen the trace significantly. Active engagement, thinking about meaning, making connections, using the information, tends to have a much stronger effect. The brain is not only counting how often something appears, it is evaluating how deeply it has been processed. Sleep plays a particularly important role in consolidation. During certain stages of sleep, especially slow-wave sleep, the brain appears to replay patterns of activity that occurred during the day. This replay is thought to help strengthen and reorganize memory traces. It is as if the brain is reviewing what happened, deciding what to keep, and integrating it with existing knowledge. Without sufficient sleep, this process is disrupted. Traces remain more fragile. Forgetting increases. This is one reason why a long, busy day followed by poor sleep can leave you with surprisingly little recall of what you did. The experiences occurred, attention may have been present, traces were formed, but the consolidation process did not have the support it needed. The result is a thinning of memory, a sense that the day has slipped away. There is also an interesting and somewhat counterintuitive aspect to how memories fade. Forgetting is not always a simple loss. Sometimes it is a transformation. As traces are revisited, they can change. Details may be filled in, altered, or simplified. The brain is not replaying a perfect recording, it is reconstructing from stored elements. Over time, the original trace can become less distinct as it is integrated with other experiences, beliefs, and interpretations. This means that what fades is not always the entire memory, but the precision of it. You may retain the general idea of an event while losing the exact sequence, the specific words, the finer details. The trace becomes more abstract. This is not necessarily a failure. It can be useful. Abstraction allows the brain to extract patterns and meaning, which are often more valuable for future behavior than exact details. But it does mean that the vividness of a moment tends to diminish unless it is revisited or reinforced. Context also matters in whether a trace survives. Memories are often tied to the context in which they were formed. This includes physical surroundings, emotional state, and even internal conditions like hunger or fatigue. When you're in a similar context later, it can be easier to retrieve the memory. When the context changes significantly, retrieval can become more difficult. The trace may still exist, but the cues needed to access it are weaker or absent. This is why you might remember something when you return to a place where it happened, even if you could not recall it elsewhere. The environment provides cues that help reactivate the neural pattern. Without those cues, the trace remains dormant, not necessarily gone, but harder to reach. In some cases, it may eventually fade entirely if it is never reactivated. The brain also engages in a kind of prioritization during consolidation. Not all traces are treated equally. Some are marked as more important based on factors like emotional significance, relevance to goals, novelty, and repetition. These traces are more likely to be strengthened and integrated. Others are allowed to weaken. This is not a conscious decision, but a result of how different systems in the brain interact. There is something almost practical about this. If every trace were preserved with equal strength, the brain would become overloaded with detail. By allowing many traces to fade, the system maintains flexibility and efficiency. It keeps what seems useful and lets go of what seems less so. This process is ongoing. It continues throughout life. It shapes what remains accessible and what disappears. It is also worth noting that forgetting does not always mean complete loss. Some traces become so weak that they cannot be retrieved under normal conditions, but they may still influence behavior in subtle ways. A past experience you cannot consciously recall may still affect your preferences, reactions, or decisions. The trace exists in a reduced or implicit form. It is not part of your narrative memory, but it is not entirely gone. This can be seen in skills and habits. You may not remember the specific moments when you learned to ride a bicycle, but the ability remains. The detailed traces of those learning experiences have faded, but the functional outcome has been preserved. The brain has extracted what was needed and allowed the rest to dissolve. There is a quiet elegance in this system. It is not designed to honour every moment equally. It is designed to extract value, to build models, to support action. The fragility of the trace is not a flaw. It is part of a process that allows the brain to remain adaptable. By letting many traces fade, the system avoids being trapped in excessive detail. It keeps itself open to new information. Still, from a human perspective, there is something bittersweet about this. You can live a moment fully, feel it clearly, and yet know that unless certain conditions are met, it will not remain in detail. It will become part of a broader impression, or it will disappear entirely. This does not mean the moment was meaningless. It means the trace it left was not strong enough to endure, and yet some traces do endure. They survive the fragile early stage. They are strengthened, consolidated, integrated. They become part of the structure of your memory, available to be revisited, reshaped, and connected to other parts of your life. These are the moments that feel like they define you, that you can return to and recognize. The difference between those that remain and those that fade often comes down to what happens in this early period, how much attention was given, whether the trace was reinforced, whether sleep supported consolidation, whether the experience connected to something meaningful, whether interference was low or high, whether the brain judged the moment as worth keeping. So the fragile trace is not just the beginning of memory, it is also the beginning of forgetting. It is the point at which the future of an experience is decided, often quietly, often quickly. Some traces will grow stronger, others will fade almost immediately. Most will fall somewhere in between, becoming part of a general sense rather than a detailed record. And even for those that survive, the story is not finished. A memory that has been formed and consolidated is not fixed forever. It can still change. It can be strengthened or weakened, reshaped or reinterpreted, depending on how it is used and revisited. The trace, once fragile, becomes more stable, but it never becomes entirely permanent. So the question becomes not only how memories form and fade, but how they continue to evolve after they have been created. Because what remains is not simply stored, it is living, changing, and constantly being influenced by what comes next. There is a particular kind of forgetting that feels almost invisible while it is happening. It does not arrive with any sense of loss, no clear moment where something is taken away. Instead, it works quietly, gradually and very efficiently. The fine details of your life begin to fade long before you notice they're gone. Not the major events, not the obvious turning points, but the small textures that once made those moments feel real while you were inside them. The exact tone of someone's voice on an ordinary afternoon, the pattern of light across a table, the way a room felt before anything significant happened there. These details do not disappear all at once. They soften, they blur, and eventually they vanish. At first glance, this might seem like a minor issue. After all, you still remember the larger structure. You remember that you met someone, that you had a conversation, that you lived in a particular place, that a certain period of your life unfolded in a certain way. The outline remains, but the texture fades, and it is the texture, those small details, that once made the experience vivid. This is not an accident. It is not a mistake in the system. It is a direct consequence of how memory is built and maintained. The brain is not designed to preserve every detail with equal strength. In fact, it actively prefers to let small, specific details disappear while keeping broader patterns and meanings. This is one of the reasons memory becomes more abstract over time. To understand why, it helps to consider what detail actually costs. Every specific element of an experience requires neural representation. The colour of a wall, the exact words spoken, the position of objects, the background sounds, the timing of events. These are all pieces of information that must be encoded, linked, and potentially stored. If every detail of every moment were preserved with equal strength, the system would quickly become overloaded. It would be filled with enormous amounts of information that are rarely needed again. So the brain makes a trade. It keeps what is useful and lets go of what is not. And in many cases, the most useful aspect of an experience is not the exact detail, but the general meaning. You do not need to remember the precise wording of every conversation you've ever had. You need to remember what was said in a functional sense. You do not need to remember the exact position of every object in your kitchen yesterday. You need to know how to navigate the space and where things are usually kept. This preference for meaning over detail is one of the defining features of memory. It allows the brain to compress information, to extract patterns, and to build models of the world that can be used efficiently. But it also means that detail is often the first thing to go. You can see this clearly in how quickly recent details fade. Think about what you did 3 days ago. You may remember the main events. You went somewhere, spoke to someone, completed certain tasks, but the fine structure is already missing. What exactly did you say during that conversation? What did the room look like? What did you notice at the time that seemed unimportant? Most of that is gone, not because it was erased in a dramatic way, but because it was never reinforced strongly enough to survive. Detail is fragile because it depends heavily on context. Many details are encoded in relation to a specific moment, a specific arrangement of circumstances. When that context is no longer present, the cues that would help retrieve those details are weaker. The brain does not store details as isolated facts. It stores them as part of a network. When the network is no longer activated in the same way, the details become harder to access. This is why returning to a place can suddenly bring back details that seemed lost. The environment provides cues that reactivate parts of the network. You may walk into a room and suddenly remember where something used to be, or what was said there years ago. The details were not entirely gone, they were simply inaccessible without the right triggers. But if those triggers are never encountered again, the details continue to weaken. Time accelerates this process. The longer a detail is not revisited, the weaker its trace becomes. And because small details are rarely revisited, they tend to disappear first. You might recall the general idea of a past event many times, reinforcing that core memory. But each time you recall it, you are less likely to focus on the peripheral details. Over time, the memory becomes more streamlined. The central narrative remains, while the edges fade. There is also a kind of competition happening within memory. Stronger, more meaningful elements tend to dominate. When you recall an event, your mind reconstructs it using the most salient pieces. These pieces become reinforced. The weaker details, which are not part of the main reconstruction, are left behind. This creates a gradual narrowing of the memory. It becomes clearer in some respects and emptier in others. This narrowing is not necessarily a problem. In many cases, it is beneficial. It allows you to retain what matters most without being burdened by excessive detail. But it does change the nature of memory. What you remember becomes less like a recording and more like a summary. Emotion plays an interesting role here as well. As we have seen, emotional experiences are more likely to be remembered. But even in emotionally charged memories, detail is not always preserved evenly. Certain aspects of the event, particularly those tied to the emotional core, are retained more strongly. Other aspects may fade just as they would in any other memory. For example, someone might remember the feeling of a significant moment very clearly, while being unable to recall specific details about the environment or the sequence of events. The emotional trace remains vivid, but the surrounding detail becomes indistinct. This is because the brain prioritizes what it considers most important, and emotional significance often outweighs sensory precision. There is also a phenomenon where detail fades while confidence remains high. People can feel very certain about a memory even as its details have changed or diminished. This is partly because the brain does not always signal the loss of detail explicitly. It reconstructs what it can and fills in gaps with what seems plausible. The result is a memory that feels complete, even if it is not entirely accurate. This reconstruction process is one reason why memories can shift over time. As details fade, the brain relies more on general knowledge, expectations, and repeated retellings. The memory becomes shaped not only by the original event, but by everything that has happened since. Each recall is an opportunity for subtle change. The more a memory is recalled in a simplified form, the more that simplified form becomes the version that is remembered. This is particularly noticeable in stories we tell about our own lives. When you recount an event, you tend to focus on the main points. You may omit small details, either because they seem irrelevant or because they are harder to recall. Over time, the version of the event that you tell becomes the version that you remember. The details that were left out become increasingly difficult to recover. Routine accelerates the loss of detail in another way. When experiences are similar, the brain often merges them into a single general memory. Instead of remembering each instance separately, it forms a composite. This is efficient, but it further reduces the retention of specific details. Days that follow a similar pattern can blend together, leaving behind a general impression rather than distinct memories. This blending effect is one reason why time can feel compressed in retrospect. When many similar experiences are combined into a single representation, the individual moments lose their distinctness. It becomes difficult to separate one day from another. The details that would differentiate them have faded, and what remains is a summary. There is something slightly paradoxical about this. The more routine a period of life is, the less detail it leaves behind, even though it may have been lived fully at the time. Conversely, periods filled with novelty and variation tend to produce more distinct memories, even if they were not necessarily more meaningful in an emotional sense. The difference lies in how much detail was encoded and retained. Attention, again, plays a crucial role. Details are more likely to be retained if they were attended to deeply at the time of the experience, but even then, without reinforcement, they may still fade. Attention gives detail a chance, but it does not guarantee permanence. There is also a limit to how much detail can be maintained even with strong attention. The brain cannot keep every aspect of every experience indefinitely. It must prioritize, it must simplify. This is part of what allows you to function without being overwhelmed. The loss of detail is not always something we notice directly. It becomes apparent when we try to recall something precisely and find that we cannot. We may remember that a conversation happened, but not the exact words. We may remember a place, but not its finer features. We may remember a person, but not the subtle expressions that once felt so clear. This can create a sense of distance from our own past. The events are still there in a general sense, but they feel less immediate. The richness that once defined them has diminished. What remains is a simplified version, a kind of outline. Yet this outline is often enough for the purposes of everyday life. It allows us to navigate, to learn, to maintain a sense of continuity. The brain does not require perfect detail to function effectively. In fact, too much detail could interfere with the ability to generalize and make decisions. There is also a certain adaptability in this process. By allowing details to fade, the brain remains open to new information. It avoids being overly constrained by the specifics of past experiences. This flexibility is important for learning and adaptation. Still, there is a quiet cost. The small moments that once filled our days, the subtle details that made them unique, are not preserved. They are lived, and then they pass. What remains is shaped by what the brain found useful, meaningful, or worth keeping. This does not mean that those moments were unimportant. It means that importance, in the context of memory, is defined differently. It is tied to function, relevance, and reinforcement, not to the subjective value we might assign in hindsight. In a way, the fading of detail is what allows the broader story of life to emerge. Without it, the narrative might be overwhelmed by noise. The brain trims the edges so that the central themes can stand out. It simplifies so that patterns can be recognized. But it is also why, when we look back, there is a sense that much of life has slipped away. Not because it was not lived, but because the details that gave it texture were never meant to last indefinitely. And this leads to another question. If detail fades so quickly, what determines which moments remain vivid, even years later? Why do some experiences hold their clarity while others dissolve almost immediately? The answer lies in the forces that give certain memories an advantage from the very beginning, particularly the role of emotion and significance in shaping what the brain chooses to keep. Some memories do not simply stay, they insist. They return without invitation, arrive with force, and carry a strange kind of freshness long after the day itself has gone. You may forget hundreds of ordinary mornings, whole seasons of small routines, and the exact shape of years that once felt full while you were living them. But then there are certain moments that remain stubbornly present. A sentence someone said in a flat, quiet voice. The instant bad news entered the room. The feeling of seeing a face you had not expected to see. The exact second embarrassment rushed through your body. The first time you realized you were loved, or not loved, or no longer safe, or suddenly understood. These memories do not behave like the rest. They do not fade politely into summary. They seem to plant themselves somewhere deeper, and when they return, they can feel less like recollection and more like re-entry. This is one of the clearest signs that memory is not a neutral recording system. It does not treat all moments equally and then merely store some longer than others by accident. It ranks them, it weighs them, it reacts to them, and one of the strongest forces shaping that reaction is emotion. When feeling enters experience with enough intensity, the brain changes the way it processes what is happening. Attention narrows. The body shifts state. Hormones move. Certain details become more likely to be marked as important. In simple terms, emotion tells the brain that this moment may matter beyond right now. That does not mean emotion makes memory perfect. In fact, it often does something stranger than that. It makes parts of memory unusually strong while leaving other parts distorted, incomplete, or missing. A painful moment may remain vivid for decades, yet the exact order of events may be uncertain. A joyful event may feel intensely real in emotional tone, while many surrounding details have gone soft. Emotion strengthens memory, yes, but not like a careful archivist. more like a dramatic editor with clear preferences and very little patience for balance. To understand why some moments refuse to be forgotten, it helps to think first about what emotion does to attention. Under neutral conditions, attention can drift, divide, and skim. During strong emotion, that becomes harder. Something important seems to be happening, and the brain responds by giving it priority. The world may seem to narrow around the event. Peripheral concerns fall away. You stop wondering what to eat later. You stop noticing the furniture in the same casual way. The mind orients sharply toward the source of feeling. This focused attention alone already increases the chance that the moment will be encoded more strongly than usual. But attention is only part of it. Emotion also changes the chemistry of memory. When something frightening, shocking, deeply joyful, or deeply painful happens, stress hormones and other neuromodulators influence the brain systems involved in encoding. The amygdala, a structure heavily involved in emotional processing, becomes especially relevant here. It helps flag the emotional significance of events and interacts with memory systems, including the hippocampus, in ways that can strengthen the storage of what was happening at the time. In broad terms, the brain is saying, this had better not be treated like an ordinary Tuesday. From a biological point of view, this makes excellent sense. If something intensely good or bad happens, remembering it may be useful. If a place was dangerous, remember it. If a person was cruel, remember them. If a situation led to relief, pleasure, connection, or reward, remember the conditions around it. Emotional significance often overlaps with practical significance. A brain that ignored emotion completely would miss some of the most important lessons available to a living creature. That said, the lessons do not arrive cleanly packaged. Emotion tends to strengthen what feels central, not necessarily what is objectively accurate in every detail. Imagine a humiliating moment from school, perhaps a failed answer in front of the class, or some social mistake that felt enormous at the time. Years later, the memory may still produce a flush of discomfort. You may remember the feeling with remarkable force, yet if asked about the exact arrangement of desks, the order of what people said, or whether a certain classmate was even present, you might be far less certain. The emotional centre of the memory was preserved. The edges were not guaranteed the same privilege. This is one reason emotionally vivid memories can feel almost unfair. They carry confidence. They often feel true in a deeper sense because the body remembers them. The mood returns, the old reaction reappears. But confidence is not the same as completeness. An emotional memory may be powerfully real, while still being partial, reconstructed, and in some ways mistaken. The mind remembers with emphasis, not with even-handed loyalty to every detail. Fear is one of the strongest examples of this. Fear tightens memory because fear matters to survival. A frightening encounter, a near miss, a moment of danger, a sudden accident. These are exactly the kinds of things an organism benefits from remembering. And indeed, fear often does produce lasting memory. But here again, the effect is selective. The central threat may be vividly remembered while unrelated details vanish. In extreme cases, memory can become fragmented altogether. Trauma does not simply produce a stronger version of ordinary memory. It can produce a different kind of memory, one shaped by overwhelming stress, disruption, and altered processing. This matters because people sometimes assume that if an event was intense, the memory should be precise. But intense stress can sometimes interfere with the very systems that support coherent episodic memory. Under overwhelming conditions, the brain may prioritize immediate survival reactions over orderly encoding. Fragments can be laid down powerfully. Bodily sensations, images, sounds, emotional reactions, while broader narrative structure is weakened. This is one reason traumatic memories can be both unforgettable and disorganized, emotionally forceful and narratively unstable. The moment refuses to be forgotten, but not necessarily in a calm or complete form. Joy can also create durable memories. though it often works a little differently. Moments of love, achievement, relief, belonging, astonishment, or laughter can become memorable not only because they felt good, but because they stood apart from the usual pattern. Positive emotion can sharpen attention, encourage rehearsal through retelling, and link a moment to important identity themes. The first day with someone you later loved, the instant good news arrived, the look on a face when something wonderful became real, these can remain surprisingly alive. Not because the brain is sentimental, but because the event combined emotional salience, novelty, and later reinforcement. Reinforcement matters a great deal here. Emotional memories are often revisited. We think about them, talk about them, avoid them, reinterpret them, measure later events against them. In doing so, we strengthen them. This is especially true of memories tied to identity. If a moment becomes part of the story you tell about who you are, it is much more likely to remain accessible. The heartbreak that changed your standards, the success that made you believe in your own competence, the loss that divided life into before and after. These moments are not left alone. They are mentally revisited again and again, and each revisit gives them more staying power. Of course, revisiting memory is not neutral. Every act of recall is also an act of reconstruction. That means emotional memories are not just strengthened by repetition, they are also shaped by it. Each time you remember, you may slightly alter emphasis, interpretation, sequence, or meaning. The memory becomes less like a preserved object and more like a story under revision. Yet, because the emotional core remains strong, the memory still feels deeply authentic. In some cases, what is most durable is not the exact original event, but the emotional truth the mind has built around it. This is particularly noticeable in family memories and old relationships. Two people can remember the same emotionally charged event in strikingly different ways. One recalls rejection, the other recalls misunderstanding. One remembers the silence after an argument as cold and final. The other remembers it as exhausted and temporary. Both may feel entirely sincere. Their emotional experiences at the time guided what was encoded, what was emphasized, and how later meaning was built. Memory is not just a record of events. It is a record of what those events felt like from the inside, and that makes it deeply personal. Shame has a special way of attaching itself to memory. It can make small events feel large and durable, far beyond their practical importance. A social stumble, a clumsy remark, a visible failure. These can linger with surprising force because shame is social pain, and social pain matters enormously to human beings. We are creatures whose survival historically depended not only on avoiding physical danger, but on navigating group life. To be rejected, mocked, or lowered in status could carry real consequences, so the brain often treats shame as significant. That is why people can remember tiny humiliations from years ago while forgetting whole months of ordinary life around them. The trouble is that shame is also a poor judge of scale. It can preserve moments that, in objective terms, no one else remembers or ever cared about, yet the body marked them. The self was threatened. The memory stays. It becomes one of those scenes that can still produce a bodily response decades later, as if the nervous system kept a little private archive labelled "Never Again," even if the event itself was small. Love, attachment, and loss form another powerful cluster. Relationships generate many of the most memorable moments in life because they matter to identity, safety, reward, and belonging all at once. The brain is highly tuned to social significance. A tone of voice, a certain look, a particular goodbye, the first message from someone important, the last ordinary conversation before things changed. These can become deeply fixed because human social life is not peripheral to survival. It is central. We remember people not only as facts but as emotional realities. And when something changes in a relationship, whether through intimacy, betrayal, absence, reconciliation, or death, memory pays close attention. Loss is especially powerful because it changes the meaning of past moments retroactively. An ordinary afternoon can become unforgettable, not because it seemed extraordinary at the time, but because later it became the last of its kind. The final phone call before someone died, the last walk in a house before moving away forever, the last easy conversation before a friendship ended. At the time, attention may have been ordinary. Later, however, the mind revisits the memory under new emotional light, and what once looked plain becomes radiant with significance. This is one of memory's strange qualities. Emotion does not only shape encoding in the moment. Later emotion can also intensify a memory's place in the mind. This retroactive importance is part of why grief is so entangled with memory. The grieving mind searches, revisits, replays, and in doing so often strengthens certain memories while discovering that others are distressingly unclear. People are sometimes shocked to find that they cannot easily summon the voice of someone they loved, or the precise shape of a face, or the texture of ordinary days together. At the same time, a single scene may remain painfully vivid. This unevenness is not evidence of insufficient love. It is evidence of selective encoding and emotional reinforcement. The mind kept some doors open more than others. There is also the matter of reward. Memories linked to pleasure, relief, achievement, or anticipation can become strong because reward signals help reinforce learning. The brain is not only built to remember dangers, it is built to remember what leads to benefit. A good meal after hunger, praise after effort, affection after uncertainty, success after struggle. These experiences matter because they guide future behavior. If something felt rewarding in a meaningful way, the brain has reason to preserve the circumstances around it. This can sometimes be seen in addiction, where substances or behaviors hijack reward systems and create unusually strong learning around cues, expectations, and emotional states associated with them. The memory of reward becomes sharpened, not because the experience was philosophically profound, but because the brain's reinforcement systems have been powerfully engaged. Again, this shows that emotional memory is not about dignity or narrative beauty. It is about biological significance. At a gentler level, nostalgia often relies on emotional memory of this kind: a song, a scent, a season, a street, and suddenly the past seems close. What returns is rarely the full factual detail of the earlier time. More often it is the mood, the atmosphere, the sense of who you were then, and how the world felt around that version of you. Emotion acts like a bridge. It does not restore the whole city. It lights a few windows, and sometimes those windows are enough to make the past feel briefly inhabited again. Children and adolescents often form especially potent emotional memories because so much is happening for the first time. First rejection, first attraction, first independence, first major embarrassment, first deep belonging. Novelty and emotion combine with developing identity, and the result can be a set of memories that remain unusually influential later in life. People are often shaped for years by scenes that, from the outside, seem minor, but they were encoded at a time when the self was still highly impressionable, when emotion attached itself strongly, and when the meaning of the event was still expanding. This also helps explain why emotionally important moments are often remembered in relation to self-definition. Not merely what happened, but what it seemed to say about you. I was chosen, I was excluded, I was foolish, I was capable, I was loved, I was powerless. The event becomes memorable because it is not stored as neutral data. It is tied to identity, and memories tied to identity tend to resist fading because they continue to matter in the present. They influence expectations, relationships, risk tolerance, confidence, and how later experiences are interpreted. Unfortunately, this means that inaccurate or overly harsh emotional memories can keep shaping a life long after the original event should have lost its authority. A few early humiliations may convince a person they are always awkward. A painful rejection may be recalled not as one event, but as proof of unworthiness. Emotional memory can be deeply informative, but it can also overgeneralize. The brain prefers significance over nuance. It learns quickly from pain, and sometimes too quickly. That is part of why therapeutic work often involves revisiting emotional memory, not merely to recall it, but to recontextualize it. If a memory has been carrying more authority than it deserves, the task is not simply to erase it, which the brain is not especially good at, but to change its meaning, soften its automatic power, and place it within a larger, more accurate framework. In a sense, the emotional memory remains, but its grip on the present can weaken. There is something important and slightly sobering in all this. The moments that refuse to be forgotten are not always the moments we would choose. The brain keeps what feels urgent, defining, painful, rewarding, or socially important. It does not ask whether preserving this memory will make your life easier 20 years later. It asks whether this mattered enough in biological and psychological terms to deserve reinforcement. Often the answer is wise, sometimes it is inconvenient, sometimes it is quietly cruel. And yet, these persistent memories also give shape to a life. They mark turning points, attach meaning, create continuity, and remind us that not all experience passes through with equal weight. A fully forgetful mind would be efficient perhaps, but thin. Emotion gives memory contour. It tells the story where the pressure points were, where the stakes rose, where the self was altered or affirmed. Even when it distorts, it reveals what the organism cared about most deeply. So when a certain memory returns again and again, refusing to behave like all the other faded scenes, it is often because emotion laid down a stronger claim. The moment was tagged as important, rehearsed by thought or feeling, bound to identity, perhaps linked to reward or threat, perhaps revisited so often that it became part of the architecture of the self. It did not merely happen, it struck, and the brain, in its practical and unruly way, decided that striking moments are worth keeping close. But this leaves us with another puzzle. If emotion can make certain experiences stay vivid, why does so much else collapse into a blur, even whole stretches of perfectly real life? Why do years sometimes feel shorter in memory than the days themselves ever did while living them? To answer that, we have to look at the way the mind compresses time itself, reducing long periods into manageable summaries and letting the fine grain fall away. It can feel a little insulting to discover that the brain does not only fail to keep everything, but also appears to participate actively in getting rid of things. We tend to imagine forgetting as a passive loss, as if memories simply weaken through neglect, the way old fabric thins in sunlight, and sometimes that is part of it. But the fuller truth is more interesting. The brain is not merely a place where memories fade. It is also a place where memories are sorted, trimmed, suppressed, overwritten, reorganized, and in some cases deliberately weakened because keeping everything would be a problem. Forgetting is not just what happens when memory fails. It is something the mind needs in order to remain useful. At first, that may sound harsh. After all, these are your experiences. Your life is made of them. Why should any healthy system be in the business of letting them go? But the answer becomes clearer the moment you consider the alternative. A mind that could not forget would be buried under detail. It would not be nobly complete. It would be cluttered, slow, distracted, and in many situations unable to generalize well enough to function. The brain is not trying to preserve a perfect museum of your past. It is trying to help you live in the present and prepare for what comes next. That job requires cleanup. This cleanup is happening all the time, and not only after dramatic events or during aging. It happens in the ordinary flow of cognition. The brain is constantly deciding what should remain active, what should be stored more strongly, what should be reduced to a gist, and what should be allowed to weaken. This is not one single mechanism. It is a family of processes that together make memory manageable. Some of them occur during waking life, as attention shifts and old traces are crowded out by new ones. Some occur during sleep, when the brain consolidates certain experiences and appears to downscale or discard others. Some involve inhibition, where the brain actively suppresses competing or irrelevant information. Some involve structural changes in the strength of neural connections themselves. The result is that memory remains selective not only at the beginning but throughout its entire life. One of the easiest ways to understand why forgetting is necessary is to think about learning. Learning is not just adding new information, it is also reducing confusion. If every similar experience remained equally vivid and equally available, the mind would struggle to extract patterns. Imagine trying to understand what a dog is if every single dog you had ever seen remained in memory with the same force, all barking for attention at once, each demanding to be treated as entirely separate. What helps you think clearly is not the preservation of every single instance in full detail, but the brain's ability to smooth across many examples and build a category. This process requires selective loss. The exact shape of one tail, one patch of grass, one background sound during one walk. These details are often not needed. What matters is the pattern that remains after the extras have been trimmed away. This is true of social learning too. You do not need to remember every sentence someone ever said in order to know whether they are trustworthy, funny, tense, kind, evasive, or generous. In fact, if you could not let the minor details fall away, it might become harder to see the larger truth. The brain's cleanup system helps compress repeated experience into a usable model. It keeps the pattern and reduces the noise. That is one of the great hidden purposes of forgetting. There is also the matter of interference. Memory is not a tidy shelf where items sit quietly without affecting one another. It is a crowded and active system in which traces compete. Similar information can overlap. Old material can interfere with new learning, and new material can interfere with older traces. If the brain did not have ways of reducing the strength of irrelevant, outdated, or duplicate information, the competition would become much worse. Forgetting helps reduce that competition. It clears space, not in the simplistic sense of making literal empty boxes in the mind, but in the functional sense of lowering the mental volume of what no longer deserves priority. A useful example is language. When you learn a new word or a new meaning for an old word, your brain must integrate it into a network of related concepts. If every previous association remained equally strong forever, learning would be less flexible. The system would be more rigid, more crowded with competing responses. A certain amount of weakening and updating is needed so that the most relevant meanings can rise more quickly, and the less useful ones can step back. In this sense, forgetting is not the enemy of learning. It is one of a learning's tools. The same applies to movement and habit. When you first learn a skill, many small details may be consciously present. Later, as the skill becomes automatic, much of that detail is no longer needed in conscious memory. The brain extracts the structure of the action and lets the precise episodes of practice fade. This is efficient. You do not need to remember the 5th time you tied your shoelaces as a child in order to tie them now. You do not need to preserve the exact sensation of each driving lesson once the skill has been absorbed. Cleanup allows the system to retain competence while discarding the scaffolding. This principle, keep the ability, lose the excess episode, runs through much of mental life. It is one reason forgetting can be so easy to misunderstand. We tend to value the episodic side of memory because it feels personal. We care about the moments. But the brain often values the extracted lesson or skill more than the original moment that taught it. If the lesson remains, the episode may be allowed to fade. From the perspective of survival and function, that is often a good trade. Sleep appears to play a major role in this cleanup. Popular descriptions of sleep often emphasize memory consolidation, and rightly so, but consolidation is not the whole story. Sleep also seems to involve selection. Not everything from the day is strengthened, Some traces are replayed and stabilized while others are not. There is evidence that the sleeping brain helps prioritize memories according to relevance, emotional weight, novelty, and future usefulness. At the same time, certain synaptic connections may be globally downscaled, a kind of recalibration that prevents the nervous system from becoming overloaded by the sheer accumulation of waking activity. During the day, learning strengthens countless connections. If all of that strengthening simply accumulated without correction, the system could become inefficient and noisy. Sleep may help reset the balance, preserving what matters while reducing the rest. This is a remarkable idea. While you sleep, the brain is not only keeping things, it is also pruning. It is deciding in effect what deserves the metabolic cost of persistence. It is helping the next day arrive with a mind that is still plastic, still capable of further learning, not jammed with yesterday's unfiltered residue. Forgetting in this sense is part of nightly maintenance. There is a similar process at work across development. The young brain is famously adaptable, but it is also exuberant in its connectivity. Early in life, the nervous system creates an enormous number of connections, more than it will ultimately keep. Over time, through experience and maturation, some connections are strengthened and others are pruned. This pruning is not damage, it is refinement. The system becomes more efficient by losing what is less useful. The result is a brain that is less diffuse, more specialized, and better tuned to the world it actually inhabits. Here again, selective loss is part of healthy development. This should make us cautious about talking as though all forgetting were a failure. In many cases, forgetting is the sign of a brain functioning properly. To remember everything equally would not be a mark of wisdom. It might be a mark of impaired selection. There are people with unusually strong autobiographical memory who can recall astonishing amounts of their personal past in detail, and while this sounds enviable from a distance, it can also be burdensome. Some describe being trapped in continual recollection, unable to let old slights, griefs, embarrassments, or minor events recede naturally. The ordinary softening of emotional edges, the ability to let the past become past, is part of mental health. A mind that never cleaned up after itself would not necessarily be freer. It might be crowded and haunted. The emotional side of cleanup is especially important. Not all painful memories should vanish, of course. Pain teaches. But not every pain deserves equal access forever. If every embarrassment remained bright, every small failure stayed near the surface, every anxious rehearsal kept its full charge, daily life would be exhausting. Part of emotional resilience involves the weakening of certain memory links over time, the reduction of their intensity, the placement of them in a larger context so that they no longer dominate present experience. Forgetting helps this happen. Even when an event is not erased, its accessibility, vividness, and emotional sharpness may lessen. That softening is one of the ways the mind makes continued living possible. Suppression and inhibition also belong to the cleanup system. These are not quite the same as forgetting, though they often contribute to it. Sometimes the brain actively dampens a memory or a competing thought because it is not useful in the moment. If you're trying to remember your current phone number, it helps if your old one does not leap forward first. If you're trying to speak in one language, it helps if another stays quieter for the moment. If you're trying to focus on a meeting, it helps if the lyrics of a song that wandered into your head do not become the main event. The brain is constantly inhibiting irrelevant or competing material. Over time, repeated inhibition can make some traces less accessible. In this way, forgetting may partly arise from the ongoing need to keep certain information from interfering with current goals. This suggests something slightly strange but very useful. Memory is shaped not only by what the brain rehearses, but also by what it repeatedly pushes aside. The mind is not a passive room where thoughts come and go. It is an active regulator. It protects the present from being overwhelmed by the past. When this protective function is working well, we hardly notice it. When it is not, as in certain anxiety disorders, trauma responses, or intrusive thought patterns, life can become dominated by material that ought to have been softened, inhibited, or placed more firmly in the background. There is also the simple fact that the world changes, and memory must change with it. A clean-up system is needed because old information can become misleading. The route to a place changes, a person's habits change, a rule changes, a danger disappears, a food that once caused sickness is no longer present, a belief once useful is no longer accurate. If the brain could not weaken outdated information and update its models, it would become increasingly tied to the past in unhelpful ways. Forgetting supports adaptation by allowing mental representations to stay current. This can be seen in relationships. The brain must continually update its understanding of the people around you. If someone who was once unreliable becomes consistent, or someone once safe becomes volatile, the mind needs to adjust. That adjustment may involve strengthening new patterns and weakening older ones. Memory is not there simply to preserve who someone used to be. It is there to help you respond to who they are now. Cleanup makes that possible. Of course, this updating is imperfect. People sometimes hold on to outdated emotional models for years because certain memories are too strong or too often rehearsed. But the brain at its healthiest is not trying to preserve every old version of reality forever. It is trying to revise, and revision requires a degree of forgetting. There is a lovely plainness to all this. The brain cleans up because life continues. Each day brings more input, more associations, more partial traces. Without pruning, downscaling, inhibition, updating, and the ordinary fading of what no longer matters, the system would become less usable with time, not more. Forgetting is what prevents mental life from becoming a hoarder's house of impressions, stacked to the ceiling with every receipt, wrapper, newspaper, and broken chair experience ever produced. And yet, because we are human, there is always some resistance to this idea. We do not like to think that moments disappear because they were not needed. That can sound cold, especially when we're talking about parts of our own lives. A quiet evening with someone we once loved may not have taught a practical lesson. A walk with a parent may not have offered a strategic advantage. A room from childhood may no longer be useful knowledge in any obvious sense, and still we may ache at how little of it remains in crisp form. The brain's cleanup system is not sentimental. It is efficient. That is one of its strengths and one of its sorrows. Yet even here there is something worth noticing. Forgetting the details of a period does not mean the period left nothing behind. Cleanup often removes the visible footprint while leaving the structural influence. You may not remember the hundreds of ordinary evenings that made up a peaceful childhood home, but the nervous system may still carry what those evenings taught about safety. You may not remember every small kindness from a friend, but you may still carry a model of what trust feels like. The cleanup system clears the clutter while leaving the architecture. In that sense, forgetting is not always the opposite of keeping. Sometimes it is how deeper keeping becomes possible. This is particularly clear in emotional regulation. A child does not remember every instance of being soothed, fed, watched over, or ignored, but repeated patterns shape the developing mind and body. The exact episodes disappear while the expectations remain. The cleanup system lets the individual events fall away because the extracted meaning has already been installed. The same is true later in life. Repeated environments, repeated relationships, repeated stresses, repeated joys, all of these may vanish as individual scenes while continuing to shape the person through mood, habit, posture toward the world, and interpretation of new experience. It is tempting to wish for both, full detail and full abstraction, perfect preservation and perfect efficiency. But the brain cannot have it both ways. To remain adaptable, it must let much go. To see patterns, it must trim specifics. To move forward, it must quiet old material. To learn, it must update. Cleanup is not optional. It is the price of being a living system that continues to change. There is something else important here, and it concerns peace. Human beings do not only need to remember how to survive and act, they also need relief from accumulation. The mind cannot indefinitely carry the full emotional charge of everything it has lived. The softening of memory, the reduced accessibility of certain pains, the fact that yesterday's irritation is not felt with full brightness a year later, all this is part of how life remains livable. There is mercy in the cleanup. Not always enough mercy, and not always delivered evenly, but some. It allows experience to settle rather than endlessly vibrate. This does not mean that the brain always cleans wisely. Sometimes it lets go of what we wish it had kept, and keeps what we wish it would release. Sometimes grief attaches strongly while tenderness blurs. Sometimes the anxious mind rehearses threats so often that they refuse to soften. Sometimes trauma bypasses ordinary cleanup and remains intrusive. Memory is not morally elegant, it is biological. Its cleanup system is brilliant, but not perfect. Still, on the whole, forgetting is necessary because remembering is expensive, and because life is not meant to be lived backward through total recall. It is meant to be lived forward with working models, updated expectations, softened wounds, and enough space for new impressions to matter. The brain clears away not because your past was worthless, but because the present keeps arriving, and a mind that could not make room for it would soon lose its ability to live well at all. So the next time it feels a little sad that you cannot remember every meal, every face in a crowd, every ordinary sunset, every quiet hour that once seemed too normal to lose, it may help to remember that the same system that allowed those details to fade is also the one that lets you learn, adapt, generalize, heal, and continue. Forgetting is not a betrayal of life. It is one of the conditions that makes ongoing life possible. And yet, even with all this cleanup, memory still leaves us with a peculiar impression. We often feel as though the past is larger and fuller than the few scenes we can actually call back. We carry a sense of richness that far exceeds the number of detailed memories we possess. That raises the next mystery. If so much has been trimmed, blurred, and allowed to vanish, why does life still feel, in retrospect, more densely lived than it can be specifically remembered? There is a strange confidence we carry about our own past, even when we know, in some sober and practical sense, that we have forgotten most of what we have lived. Life still feels full behind us. It feels vast. It feels layered. It feels as though it contains a great many rooms, even if, when we go looking, only a few doors will actually open. This is one of the quietest illusions memory creates. We walk around with the sense of having a rich and continuous past, and in one sense that feeling is absolutely true, but in another sense it is built from far less detail than we imagine. If you test this gently on yourself, the oddness becomes clear very quickly. Think of a year from your life, perhaps one that mattered to you, perhaps one that seemed ordinary at the time but now feels settled into the larger shape of who you are. You likely have a feeling about that year. Maybe it was tense, maybe it was lonely, maybe it was full of movement, or confusion, or relief. Perhaps you remember where you lived, what kind of person you were trying to be, what worried you, who was around, what the general air of life felt like. All of that may come quite readily. But if you try to name in detail what happened on 50 ordinary afternoons from that year, the mind suddenly becomes much less generous. The year feels full. The accessible memories are sparse. This gap between felt fullness and retrievable detail is not a contradiction. It is one of the central features of autobiographical memory. The mind does not preserve the past as a complete set of scenes. It preserves fragments, summaries, themes, emotional tones, repeated patterns, and a narrative structure that gives the impression of continuity. In other words, your sense of a full past is built not from full storage, but from intelligent compression. The brain has not kept every page. It has kept enough pieces to convince you there was always a whole book behind them. That is not a deception in the malicious sense. It is more like a useful shortcut, one that helps you remain a coherent person. If your past were available only as a few isolated scenes with nothing linking them, Identity would feel thin and disjointed. You would know certain moments, perhaps even vividly, but you would struggle to feel that they belong to one long unfolding life. What the brain does instead is build bridges. It fills the gaps with semantic knowledge about yourself, with emotional summaries of different periods, with repeated facts, habits, relationships, preferences, and recurring concerns. From these pieces, a sense of personal continuity emerges. This is one reason you can know a period of your life better than you can remember it. You may not have dozens of detailed episodic memories from a certain year, but you still know what that year was about. You know you were anxious then, or in love, or trying to start over, or taking care of someone, or drifting, or rebuilding. That knowledge is real. It is not imagined. But it is not the same thing as having the year preserved in cinematic detail. It is more like having the map instead of the walk. And the mind is very good at turning maps into the feeling of territory. A few anchor memories, some repeated facts, and a stable emotional summary can create a powerful impression of fullness. Childhood is a particularly good example. Most adults remember relatively little of childhood in the form of detailed scenes, and yet childhood often feels enormous in retrospect. It feels long, textured, full of places, people, moods, seasons, rooms, rules, smells, and daily life. Some of this comes from actual surviving fragments, but much of it comes from the fact that the mind holds a broad model of childhood, built from family stories, photographs, repeated routines, general knowledge, and the emotional atmosphere associated with those years. The remembered childhood is not false, it is simply broader than the number of directly retrievable episodes would suggest. This is why old homes can feel so haunting. You may return to a place and be struck not because you had retained hundreds of crisp memories of it, but because the place acts as a cue for an entire compressed period of life. Suddenly the body knows, the mind supplies atmosphere, details begin to stir, though often incompletely. A staircase, a window, a smell of old paint or dust, and the sense of a whole world returns. It can feel as if the past was waiting there in full. But often what has returned is not a complete archive. It is the emotional and narrative model of a former life becoming active again. The same thing happens with people. You may feel that you remember someone very well, even when, in strict detail, you remember relatively few actual encounters. What remains is the person model, how they tended to sound, what being around them felt like, the sort of reactions they had, the role they played in your life. That model is built from repeated experience, not from the preservation of every single episode. So the relationship feels full in memory, even though only a handful of scenes may remain sharply accessible. The rest is carried as structure, not footage. This structure is part of what creates the illusion of a continuous interior life. We believe, with good reason, that we have been ourselves all along. Yet the evidence available to consciousness is often patchy. The brain solves this by maintaining a narrative self. It keeps a story going. Not a fiction exactly, but a selective account of who you have been, what has mattered, what kind of person you are, and how one period led into another. This narrative self is immensely useful. It helps with decision-making, social life, planning, moral judgment, and emotional continuity. But because it is smooth where memory is actually ragged, it can make the past feel more evenly available than it really is. That smoothing process is one reason the past often seems calmer and more shaped than it truly felt at the time. Once a period has been compressed into a summary, the uncertainty and noise of daily living get edited out. The mind keeps the main themes. Looking back, you may think, that was my year of confusion, or that was when things started improving, or that was the difficult winter. These summaries are not wrong, but they are cleaner than real life ever was. The lived period was full of mixed days, interruptions, side worries, forgotten errands, meaningless conversations, bodily discomforts, ordinary meals, random moments of boredom, and all the rest of what actually makes up a life. Summary replaces clutter. The result is not only memory, but interpretation. This interpretive quality matters because it means we do not merely remember the past, we curate it. Not deliberately most of the time, but continuously. Each recollection privileges some aspects and neglects others. Each retelling sharpens certain angles and softens competing ones. Over time, the past begins to feel organised around what later seemed meaningful. This gives life a pleasing structure, but it can also make it feel fuller than the retrievable evidence strictly supports. There is also the matter of familiarity. A period of life can feel full simply because it was inhabited for a long time, even if little of it remains in detail. Repetition builds a sense of density. Years spent in one town, one relationship, one school, one job, one family home, these periods leave strong general models. You know the shape of them. You know what it was like to be there. That sense of knowing contributes to the feeling that the past is richly preserved. But much of what creates that feeling is not episodic memory in the narrow sense. It is semanticized personal memory, a kind of general knowledge about your own life. This distinction between episodic and semantic memory is crucial. Episodic memory is the ability to mentally revisit a specific event situated in time and place. Semantic memory is broader knowledge, including facts, concepts, and also facts about your own life. You may not remember your first day in a certain apartment in detail, but you know you lived there for 2 years, that the kitchen was narrow, that the windows faced west, that you were tired often then, that you listened to the same songs at night. This is autobiographical knowledge, but not necessarily episode-based recollection. Much of the felt fullness of the past comes from this kind of knowledge. And because semantic memory is more durable than many individual episodes, it helps sustain the sense of richness long after the details have gone. You may forget 100 separate evenings, but retain the knowledge that that was a happy period, or a lonely one, or the time when you cooked the same soup all winter, or when your friend kept calling late at night. These larger truths survive, and because they imply many lived moments behind them, they make the past feel densely populated even when the moments themselves are unavailable. It is also worth noticing how little is needed for the mind to infer abundance. A few vivid memories can stand in for much more than themselves. One beach holiday scene may come to represent an entire family era. One college memory may seem to contain the whole atmosphere of those years. One hospital corridor may carry the feeling of an entire season of fear. The brain is quite willing to let a single strong image act as ambassador for a much larger portion of life. That ambassador then helps support the sense that the larger territory still exists within you in some rich and latent way. Sometimes this is true. Sometimes it is not. That is part of the illusion. We often feel that if only the right cue were found, all those lost details would come flooding back, and occasionally a cue does unlock more than expected. A smell, a song, a certain slant of light, a phrase, the sound of cutlery in a particular room. These cues can be powerful because they reconnect the current mind to old neural patterns, but even then, what returns is usually partial. The cue reveals that more was stored than you could normally access, but not necessarily that the whole past remains intact somewhere in complete form. The mind feels the nearness of the larger past and mistakes that nearness for full possession. This helps explain why nostalgia can be so emotionally persuasive. Nostalgia does not usually restore a period in full accuracy. It restores enough atmosphere to make the past feel inhabited again. A few songs from adolescence, for example, can create the astonishing impression that an entire former self has returned for a moment. The old emotional weather comes back. The body remembers. The mind fills in the rest. What you experience is not total retrieval, but a compressed world swelling briefly back into presence. It feels rich because the brain is excellent at extrapolating from fragments. The illusion of fullness is also supported by the way memory and imagination overlap. When you think about the past, you are not simply replaying stored scenes. You are reconstructing, often with the same systems that help you imagine other times and possibilities. This means that some of the felt continuity of the past is actively generated in the present. You do not only retrieve it, you build it, using traces, knowledge, identity, and expectation. The result is often convincing. It feels like contact with what was. And indeed, it is contact, but not the kind of contact people imagine when they think of memory as playback. There is nothing inherently false or unhealthy about this. In many ways, it is necessary. A full and detailed archive would be unwieldy. What you need for ordinary life is not literal re-entry into every prior day, but a usable personal history. The illusion of fullness helps support that. It allows you to feel that your life has been substantial, continuous, and integrated, even though the actual contents available for recall are sparse compared to what you truly lived. Without this effect, people might experience the passage of life as a series of disconnected bursts rather than a coherent existence. The fact that memory smooths and thickens the past helps protect us from that. It gives emotional and narrative continuity to a life that, in raw retrievable units, would look far more scattered. In this sense, the illusion is not a mistake. It is one of memory's most elegant compromises. Still, there are moments when the illusion fails, and those moments can be unsettling. Someone may ask you about a period you thought you remembered well, and suddenly you realize how little you can actually say. You may look through old photographs and be struck by how many entire scenes feel foreign, despite being your own life. You may reread a journal entry and discover facts, feelings, or concerns that you had completely forgotten. These moments can produce a strange vertigo. They reveal that the full past you thought you carried is, in large part, an interpretive shell wrapped around scattered surviving pieces. This does not make the shell worthless. Quite the opposite. It is one of the ways the self is maintained. But it does mean that your sense of how much you remember is not always a reliable measure of how much you could actually retrieve. We confuse familiarity with detail, continuity with completeness, emotional summary with full recollection. Life feels richer than it is remembered because the mind has learned how to make sparsity feel inhabited. There is another layer to this as well. The past often feels full not because we can access every moment, but because we know it once existed. This may sound obvious, but it matters. Even when memories are absent, we carry an abstract awareness that whole stretches of life took place. We know there were many breakfasts, conversations, weather patterns, illnesses, errands, friendships, and evenings, even if none of them are individually available. This factual knowledge of lived duration contributes to the sense of fullness. We know the rooms were there even when we no longer have the keys. And perhaps that is why forgetting can feel sad in a particular way. Not because we believe life was empty, but because we know it was not. We know, or at least sense, that behind the few scenes we still possess was a much larger world of daily existence that mattered while it was happening. The loss is not of importance, but of access. The life was real. The access is partial. The illusion of fullness both comforts and exposes us here. It says yes, there was much more, but it cannot fully return that more to us. There is also a social side to this fullness. Other people help hold our past in place. Family stories, old friends, shared jokes, repeated anecdotes, photographs, objects, places, cultural rituals. These all reinforce the feeling that our past is larger than the set of scenes inside our own head. Sometimes other people remember things for us, or at least they remember enough to help maintain the broader shape of a period. This distributed nature of memory contributes to the sense that the past still exists in some workable form, even when our private access has thinned. In this way, personal memory is not entirely personal. It is scaffolded by the world around us. That may be one reason moving away, losing contact, or outliving certain people can make past periods feel suddenly less substantial. Some of the external supports disappear. Fewer cues remain. Fewer co-rememberers are available. The illusion of fullness weakens a little, and what was once easy to feel as a whole life period becomes harder to summon. The past has not changed, but its supports have. This can create the lonely sensation that parts of your life are becoming less real, simply because fewer things around you are helping hold them. But even then, the deeper structure often remains. The body remembers patterns, the mind keeps identity themes, emotional summaries endure, preferences, fears, comforts, ways of interpreting people, all of these can carry the imprint of periods you can barely describe. That is another reason life feels fuller than remembered. Much of the past survives not as scene-based memory, but as a current way of being. You do not remember all the moments that taught you caution, tenderness, impatience, trust, or delight, but their effects remain active in the present. The past is still operating even when it is no longer visible. This is important because it reminds us that memory is not the only way life is preserved. Experience becomes part of you in more ways than recollection. It shapes posture, expectation, temperament, vocabulary, values, reflexes, style of affection, thresholds of fear, default hopes, and tiny bodily habits. A period can be almost entirely gone as narrative and still remain as structure. So when the past feels full, that feeling is not merely an illusion in the flimsy sense. It is partly the recognition that much more of life remains in you than you can consciously narrate. Even so, conscious memory matters, and the mismatch between what is lived and what is retrievable never fully disappears. We carry a large feeling built on selective evidence. We know more of our lives than we can remember, and we remember less than our sense of self would suggest. This is not a bug at the edges of memory. It is one of its central conditions, so when life feels richer than it is remembered, that richness comes from summaries, emotional atmospheres, repeated patterns, autobiographical knowledge, narrative smoothing, fragment-based reconstruction, and the ongoing presence of past influence in current identity. The past feels populated because the mind is very skilled at building inhabited worlds from partial remains. It gives us enough continuity to feel like one person across time, enough fullness to resist the terror of emptiness, and enough compression to go on living without carrying every minute in raw detail. And yet, this same compression has another consequence. It does not only make the past feel full, it also changes the felt speed of life itself. Years begin to collapse into broader summaries, while fewer distinct details survive to mark their length. That is part of why time can seem to move faster as we age, even though the days themselves may still feel long while we are living them. To understand that, we have to follow memory into one of its most curious tricks, the way it compresses time. There is a point in adult life when people begin saying something that, as children, they could barely understand. They say the years are flying. They say summer used to feel endless. They say a decade now feels shorter than a school term once did. They do not always mean that each day itself is short. In fact, many days are still long, crowded, tiring, occasionally slow to the point of insult. A bad meeting can still stretch. A sleepless night can still crawl. Waiting for news can still make 10 minutes behave like a century. And yet, when people look backward, whole years seem to collapse. A birthday arrives and feels suspiciously recent, even though 12 full months have gone by. A holiday returns and seems to have barely left. Someone mentions an event from 6 years ago, and the mind quietly protests that it cannot possibly have been 6 years ago, because internally it still feels nearby. This is one of memory's strangest tricks. Life is not only forgotten, it is compressed. At first glance, it is tempting to treat this as a vague emotional complaint, one of those things people say when they are startled by aging, but there is something very real beneath it. Years do often seem to shrink as people get older, not because clocks change speed, and not because the earth grows impatient with your calendar, but because memory does not preserve time evenly. It stores experience in ways that affect how long a period later feels in retrospect. The felt length of life is not determined only by how long something lasted while you were living it. It is determined by how many distinct markers, variations, and memorable traces remain when you look back. This means there are really two kinds of time at work. There is lived time, the time of being inside a moment as it unfolds. Then there is remembered time, the time reconstructed afterward through memory. These do not always agree. A week of stress can feel long while you're in it, and strangely thin once it is over. A holiday can pass quickly in the moment, and later feel expansive because so much happened, so much was noticed, so many distinct traces were laid down. What we call the speed of life is often really the speed of remembered life, and remembered life depends heavily on compression. Compression is one of the brain's most useful habits. It reduces complexity. It turns repeated experience into gist, themes, and summaries. It trims redundant detail and preserves broader patterns. Without this, memory would become unmanageable. But one side effect of compression is that periods full of repetition and low variation end up represented by surprisingly little. The year happened in full while you were inside it, but in memory it becomes a handful of anchor points tied together by a general feeling. When that happens, the year later feels shorter than it actually was. Think of an ordinary month of adult routine, waking at similar hours, similar work, similar roads, similar meals, similar concerns, similar evenings. Of course, each day contained actual variation. No 2 days were perfectly identical, but from the brain's perspective, much of that month belonged to familiar patterns. The same environments, the same tasks, the same people, the same sequence of expectations. Because of this familiarity, less attention was devoted to each individual day. Less novelty was present. Fewer moments were marked as distinct. The brain stored the pattern and allowed many specific instances to blend together. Later, when you try to look back on that month, you do not find 30 richly separated days. You find a compressed block, and compressed blocks feel short. By contrast, novelty stretches remembered time. A move to a new city, a first trip somewhere unfamiliar, the start of a new relationship, the beginning of a job, a period of crisis, a week of unusual activity. All of these can seem longer in retrospect because they contain more distinct traces. More things were noticed. More attention was recruited. More details survived because the brain had reason to treat them as informative. The period becomes packed with markers. Looking back across it feels like crossing a more detailed landscape, and detailed landscapes feel longer than blank ones. This is one reason childhood often seems so large in memory, even though early life is also patchy and much of it is lost. Children encounter novelty constantly. The world is less known. Every season has more firstness in it. New rules, new fears, new pleasures, new skills, new places, new social dynamics. Even routine can feel less routine because the mind itself is still under construction. The brain is learning what the world is. That makes experience denser. Even though adult access to childhood memories is incomplete, the portions that do remain are often linked to a general sense of spaciousness. Time seemed bigger because more of it was new. As people age, life often becomes more patterned. This is not necessarily sad. Pattern can mean stability, competence, comfort, skill, belonging. It can mean less chaos. But pattern also means compression. Once the brain knows what to expect from the road to work, the office, the kitchen, the grocery store, the calendar cycle, the social rituals, the repeated obligations, it does not need to richly encode every instance. It automates, it summarizes, it keeps enough for functioning and lets the repeated scenery pass with lower memory resolution. The result is that years built from heavy routine can later seem astonishingly brief. There is a common way of explaining this that says each year becomes a smaller fraction of your total life, so of course it feels shorter. A year to a 5-year-old is 1/5 of existence. A year to a 50-year-old is only 1/50th. This is an elegant idea, and there may be some intuitive truth to it, but it does not fully explain the feeling. The more direct explanation lies in memory density. A year that leaves behind many distinct retrievable traces tends to feel longer in retrospect than a year that has been compressed into a few repeated themes. The brain does not measure duration by calendar mathematics. It measures in part by how much experiential material remains. This also explains why certain difficult periods can feel strangely long after they are over. Illness, grief, intense change, caregiving, financial stress, fear, travel across unfamiliar situations. These may all produce denser memory simply because attention is heightened and the ordinary pattern has been disrupted. The days may have been unpleasant, exhausting, or emotionally costly, but they resist compression because too much was happening at a level the brain considered important. So remembered length is not always linked to pleasure. It is linked to markedness, to how many mental signposts survived. That word matters here. Signposts. Memory reconstructs time partly by counting the signposts left behind. If you look back across a year and find many scenes, transitions, trips, changes, conversations, emotions, new skills and disruptions, the year feels populated. It has internal geography. If you look back and find only a few broad categories, work, home, stress, weekends, and perhaps one holiday, the year feels flatter. It may have been full in lived reality, but in memory it has few landmarks. Without landmarks, distance collapses. There is something a little unfair about this, because many forms of meaningful life are repetitive by nature. Parenting can be repetitive, especially in early years. Caregiving can be repetitive. Long-term work often involves repetition. Building a relationship, maintaining a home, recovering from difficulty, practicing a craft, all of these can involve long stretches of routine that matter deeply, yet leave behind fewer distinct episodic memories than brief bursts of novelty. This means the most important parts of a life are not always the parts that later feel longest. Compression is not a measure of value. It is a measure of how memory handled the material. This is why people can look back on years that were objectively full of love, labour, sacrifice and growth and feel an uneasy thinness. They know the years mattered. They know enormous things were happening inside them, yet memory offers only fragments. A child at a particular age, a kitchen in late afternoon, a conversation in a car, a holiday photo, a recurring exhaustion. The rest is held as general knowledge rather than detailed recollection. The years feel both important and strangely short. That is compression at work. Mood and mental state influence this process too. Periods of chronic stress, depression or distraction often become heavily compressed because attention was either narrowed toward urgent concerns or flattened altogether. A person living in anxiety may spend months attending mainly to threat, anticipation, bodily worry, unfinished tasks and imagined outcomes. Much of the surrounding world passes underlit. Later, that stretch of time may feel both oppressive and indistinct. It was long while it was happening, but memory kept only a narrow band of what attention had selected. Likewise, depression can make days feel slow in the moment and oddly empty afterward, because low energy and reduced engagement produce fewer distinctive traces. Time drags while you're in it, then collapses once it is gone. This mismatch between prospective and retrospective time is one of the most interesting features of memory. Prospective time is how long something feels while it is happening. Retrospective time is how long it seems once you look back. These can move in opposite directions. Boredom makes prospective time stretch. Novelty can make it disappear, but afterward, boredom often leaves few markers and therefore feels short, while novelty leaves many markers and therefore feels long. The week of waiting in a bland hotel may have crawled while you were there and almost vanished from memory later. The busy trip with constant new experiences may have flown by at the time and later feel like an entire chapter. The brain, then, is not really asking, how long did this take? It is asking something more like, how much distinct material survived, and how richly is it structured? Time in memory is reconstructed from content. More content, especially more varied and memorable content, often means a longer feeling period. Less content means compression. This is not absolute, but it is one of the strongest patterns in how remembered life is shaped. There is another layer to this, and it concerns how memory transforms experience into summary. Over time, even a richly encoded period may become more compressed. The dozens of details from a first year at university, a season of travel, a difficult breakup, or a year abroad do not all remain equally accessible forever. They begin to simplify. The mind keeps the major scenes and themes, so compression is not just about whether a period was repetitive to begin with. It also increases with time as older periods are gradually reduced to their broadest psychological outlines. This is one reason even major eras of life can later feel shorter than they once did. The detailed map has been folded again and again until only the main roads remain. And yet, some periods resist this more than others. Why? Usually because they continue to be revisited, retold, and linked to identity. If a period becomes central to the story you tell about yourself, the traces receive reinforcement. You think about that year, mention it, compare present life to it, draw lessons from it. In doing so, you help keep more of its structure alive. This is why certain years remain expansive in memory, while others vanish almost completely. It is not only what happened, but how often the period stays mentally active afterward. The social world contributes to this too. Shared memory helps preserve time. Family stories, old friends, anniversaries, photographs, social traditions, all these help maintain signposts that might otherwise disappear. A holiday repeated in conversation every year stays larger than an equally meaningful but never discussed month. A relationship with many shared artifacts remains more available than one with none. External reminders protect against compression by reactivating traces that would otherwise go quiet. Even so, compression continues. It is one of the ways the self remains manageable. Imagine if every year retained its full density forever. You would not only remember more, you would carry more transitions, more unfinished feelings, more distracting detail, more competing versions of yourself all at once. Part of maturity depends on the mind's ability to reduce the old complexity into usable themes. This is psychologically efficient. It allows identity to continue without becoming crushed by total recall. But it also creates the eerie feeling that life is speeding up. That feeling can be sharpened by repetition across the calendar. Seasonal cycles return. Birthdays recur. Holidays repeat. Work patterns repeat. Once the brain learns the general script of a year, it can process much of it at lower cost. The first time something happens, it is richly encoded. The 10th time, much less so, unless something new or emotionally important occurs. This creates a kind of annual shorthand. The mind recognizes the script and, unless variation interrupts it, stores only the deviations. Repetition becomes summary. Summary becomes speed. This can make adulthood feel like it is built from fewer and fewer fully distinct years unless effort, circumstance, or surprise keeps breaking the pattern. Again, this does not mean a repetitive year is empty. It means memory has become efficient with it. The same can happen in long relationships. Early stages often feel expansive because everything is new. Later stages may be far more meaningful, but less densely remembered in episodic form because the brain has stopped treating each encounter as novel. What remains is a deep person model, emotional continuity, and shared life structure, but fewer distinct signposts. Compression increases even as significance deepens. That may be one reason some people experience travel, learning, new environments, creative projects, and changed routines as time expanding. It is not magic. These things interrupt prediction. They require fresh attention. They produce more distinct traces. The week acquires more internal divisions. The month grows more signposts. Later, the period feels longer because it contains more retrievable variation. This does not mean constant novelty is necessary for a meaningful life, nor that one must chase stimulation in order to defeat time. It simply means memory responds to difference. It is also worth remembering that internal difference matters, not only external novelty. A new idea deeply considered, a shift in self-understanding, a change in emotional tone, a period of reflection, a serious book, a spiritual practice, learning to notice one's own experience more carefully. These can all increase the density of remembered life, even if the outer routine changes little. What matters is not just whether the scenery changed, but whether the mind engaged differently enough for more distinct traces to form. A person can live in the same apartment for 10 years and still create years of different felt length if attention, purpose, and experience vary meaningfully within them. This is where compression touches something almost philosophical. We often think of life speed as something that happens to us from the outside, as if time itself were hurrying us along. But much of what feels like speed is actually a property of memory. The more compressed the remembered structure of a period, the faster it seems to have gone. If that is true, then time's apparent acceleration is partly a story about what the mind noticed, distinguished, revisited, and retained. The calendar moves steadily. Memory edits. None of this means there's a simple recipe for making life feel longer. That would be both false and unbearably self-conscious. People cannot and should not live as their own historians, anxiously manufacturing signposts and mentally labelling every afternoon in the hope of later spaciousness. Life becomes thin in another way when it is overmanaged, but it does suggest why some periods disappear so quickly and why others continue to feel broad years later. Memory preserves distinction better than repetition. It preserves engagement better than absent-mindedness. It preserves change better than sameness. And when less is preserved, time shrinks. There is also a quiet sadness in realizing that some of the very things that make a life stable can make it feel faster in retrospect. The safe routines, the familiar home, the dependable relationships, the competent ways of moving through known environments, all these reduce novelty and increase compression. Stability makes life livable, but it can also make years harder to separate in memory. The irony is sharp. What protects us from chaos may also soften the memory of duration. But that is not an argument against stability. It is simply one more reminder that remembered time and meaningful time are not identical. In fact, some of the most compressed years are also years that matter profoundly. Years of raising children, caring for aging parents, sustaining a marriage, building a skill, surviving treatment, recovering from loss, working steadily towards something. These may later look short in memory because routine and repetition dominated daily structure. Yet their influence is enormous. They changed a life. Compression cannot be used as a measure of significance. A short feeling year may have reshaped everything. So when years seem to shrink as you age, it is not simply because you are growing older in some abstract mathematical sense. It is because memory is doing what memory does. It is extracting, summarizing, reducing redundancy, preserving signposts, and letting repeated days merge into larger blocks. Youth often contains more novelty, more first times, more distinct landmarks. Adulthood often contains more repetition, more competence, more summary. The result is a powerful shift in how time feels when remembered. And this compression leaves us with another problem, one that follows naturally from everything so far. If memory is always summarizing, always extracting patterns, always turning long stretches into a few themes and scenes, then how much of what we carry as our past is exact at all? At what point does summary become distortion? And when we remember our lives, how often are we recalling what happened versus quietly rewriting it into something smoother, simpler, and easier to hold? There is a quiet confidence most people have about their own memories. Not about every small detail, perhaps, but about the general sense of what happened, what was said, what someone meant, what kind of moment it was. Even when we admit that memory is imperfect, we often imagine the imperfections as small scratches on an otherwise faithful recording. A word changed here, a colour misremembered there, a minor mix-up in sequence. The deeper assumption remains that the core of memory is stable, that what we recall is, in essence, what occurred. But memory does not behave like a recording device with occasional glitches. It behaves more like a system that reconstructs the past each time it is accessed. That reconstruction is usually good enough to feel convincing. It preserves meaning, emotional tone, and general structure. But it is not fixed. It is influenced by what we know now, what we expect, what we have been told, how often we have revisited the memory, and even what we want or fear to be true. Because of this, memory does not only fade, it changes, it edits quietly, it simplifies, reshapes, and sometimes creates details that feel as real as anything that actually happened. This can be difficult to accept, not because the evidence is weak, but because the experience of remembering feels so direct. When you recall something, it does not feel like you are constructing it. It feels like you are returning to it. The scene appears, the voice seems to echo again, the emotional tone re-emerges, there is a sense of contact, and because that sense is so immediate, it carries authority. It feels like knowledge, not like interpretation. Yet what feels immediate is often assembled in the present. The brain retrieves fragments, links them, fills gaps, and produces a coherent account. It does this quickly and smoothly, so smoothly that the construction itself is hidden. What you experience is the result, not the process. And because the result is usually consistent with your expectations and prior recollections, it feels stable. One of the simplest ways to see this is to consider how memories change when they are retold. Imagine an event that you've described many times, perhaps a story about something amusing or frustrating that happened years ago. Each time you tell it, you naturally shape it for clarity. You emphasize certain parts, omit others, adjust wording, simplify sequences. Over time, the version you tell becomes more polished, more efficient, more focused on what seems to matter. Eventually, that version begins to replace the original experience in your own mind. The memory becomes the story, and the story becomes the memory. This process is not dishonest, it is practical. The brain prefers clarity over clutter. It trims what seems unnecessary and keeps what supports the narrative. But it also means that memory is not preserving the original moment unchanged. It is refining it into something easier to hold. This refinement often involves filling in missing details with what seems plausible. If you remember being in a cafe, your mind may supply the general features of a cafe, even if you no longer recall the specific one. If you remember a conversation, your mind may reconstruct the likely wording based on what you know about yourself and the other person. These reconstructions feel natural because they fit the pattern. They are not experienced as guesses, they are experienced as memory. This is one reason false memories can feel so convincing. They are not usually random inventions. They are built from real fragments combined with reasonable assumptions. A person may genuinely believe they remember something that never happened in that exact way because the reconstructed version fits so well with everything else they know. The mind prefers coherence, and coherence can sometimes be achieved without strict accuracy. Even small suggestions can influence this process. If someone tells you that a particular detail was present, you may later incorporate that detail into your own memory, especially if it does not conflict strongly with what you already believe. Over time, it becomes difficult to distinguish what you directly experience from what you were told. The memory feels unified, even if it has multiple sources. Emotion also plays a role in how memories are shaped. As we explored earlier, emotional moments are more likely to be remembered, but they're also more likely to be interpreted. When you recall an emotional event, you are not only retrieving what happened, you're also retrieving what it meant to you then, and what it means to you now. These meanings can change. A moment that once felt like rejection may later be understood as misunderstanding. A moment that once felt trivial may later seem significant. As interpretation shifts, the memory itself shifts with it. This is particularly noticeable in relationships. People often revisit past interactions in light of what happened afterward. A neutral comment can be reinterpreted as a warning sign. A kind gesture can be remembered as more meaningful than it seemed at the time. The memory is not static. It is updated to fit the current understanding of the relationship. This can be helpful, allowing people to make sense of their experiences, but it also means that the past is not recalled in a purely original form. Time adds another layer to this process. As details fade, the brain relies more on general knowledge and repeated versions of the memory. The fewer specific elements remain, the more room there is for reconstruction. Over time, the memory may become simpler, more consistent, and less tied to the original sensory experience. It becomes a story that feels stable, even if it has drifted from its starting point. This drift is usually subtle. It does not involve dramatic changes that would be obvious. Instead, it involves small adjustments that accumulate. A slightly different phrasing, a reordered sequence, a missing detail replaced with a likely one. Each change is minor, but together they can alter the memory in meaningful ways. And because the changes happen gradually, they are rarely noticed. Confidence does not reliably track accuracy in this process. A memory can feel very certain and still be incomplete or distorted. This is partly because confidence is influenced by how easily a memory comes to mind, how often it has been rehearsed, and how well it fits with other knowledge. A frequently recalled memory tends to feel more solid, regardless of whether it is perfectly accurate. Familiarity creates a sense of truth. There is also a tendency to remember the meaning of an event more reliably than its exact details. This is often useful. It allows the brain to extract lessons and patterns, but it also means that the precise structure of the event can change while the meaning remains consistent. A person may remember that a conversation was hurtful without remembering exactly what was said. The emotional truth is preserved, but the factual details become less certain. In some cases, the meaning itself can be shaped by later experience. If a person later learns something new about a situation, they may reinterpret the original event. This reinterpretation can influence how the memory is reconstructed in the future. The past is not simply recalled, it is understood again, each time in the context of the present. This can be seen in how people remember their own development. A person might look back and see a clear progression, as if one stage led neatly to the next. In reality, the process was likely more uneven, with doubts, reversals, and uncertainties. Memory smooths these irregularities. It creates a narrative that feels coherent. This narrative is not false, but it is simplified. It highlights continuity and downplays confusion. There is also a protective aspect to memory's flexibility. In some cases, the mind may soften or reshape memories to reduce distress. This does not mean that painful events are erased, but their intensity or interpretation may change over time. This can help people move forward without being overwhelmed by past experiences. At the same time, it can make it difficult to access the original emotional state with full clarity. Of course, memory does not always soften in helpful ways. Sometimes it does the opposite, reinforcing negative interpretations or exaggerating certain aspects of an event. A single criticism can grow in memory until it feels larger than it was. A moment of embarrassment can become more vivid and central than it deserves. In these cases, the reconstruction process amplifies rather than reduces the impact. The fact that memory is flexible does not mean it is unreliable in a useless sense. It is still the primary way we understand our past, but it does mean that memory should be approached with a certain humility. What we recall is shaped by many influences, and it is not a perfect record. It is a living system, responsive to context, meaning, and repetition. This becomes especially important when memories are used as evidence in serious contexts. People often place great trust in confident recollection, but research has shown that even sincere and detailed memories can contain errors. This does not imply dishonesty. It reflects the way memory works. It reconstructs rather than replays. In everyday life, these small distortions are usually harmless. They may even be helpful, allowing us to maintain a coherent sense of self and to communicate experiences effectively. But they also remind us that the past we carry is not identical to the past that occurred. It is a version of it shaped by time, attention, emotion, and repeated reconstruction. There is something both unsettling and freeing in this realization. Unsettling because it challenges the idea that our memories are fixed and reliable. Freeing because it suggests that the past is not entirely rigid. It can be understood in new ways. It can be reinterpreted. The meaning of an experience is not locked in place forever. This does not mean we can rewrite the past at will. The core events, the things that happened, remain part of our history. But the way those events are represented in memory is not fixed. It can change as we change. This allows for growth, for new understanding, and for the possibility that the same past can support different futures. So memory errors are not simply mistakes to be avoided. They are part of the system that allows memory to function at all. A perfectly accurate, unchanging record might sound ideal, but it would lack the flexibility that makes learning and adaptation possible. The mind trades perfect fidelity for usefulness. It keeps what matters most, reshapes what it can, and lets go of what it no longer needs. And yet, even with all this reconstruction and quiet rewriting, there is still something that feels stable. Despite the changes, despite the fading and reshaping, we still experience ourselves as the same person across time. We still feel continuity. That sense of continuity is not built from perfect memory. It comes from something deeper, something that holds together even as individual memories shift and change. By the time most people go to bed, they have already lived through far more than they will keep. A day can feel crowded while it is happening. There are words, errands, worries, sensations, faces, decisions, small irritations, passing pleasures, things noticed briefly and then replaced by the next thing. By evening, it may seem as though the day has become heavy with content, almost too much to hold at once. And then night arrives, and something curious begins. Sleep does not simply turn the lights down on consciousness. It begins sorting. It begins reviewing. It begins, in its quiet biological way, deciding what among the day's traces might deserve greater stability and what can be allowed to weaken. In that sense, sleep is not just rest. It is part of the great editorial process by which a life becomes rememberable at all. This is one of the reasons forgetting cannot be understood only as something that happens because memory fails. Forgetting is also shaped by what the sleeping brain chooses not to reinforce. During the day, attention opens the gate to experience. The fragile trace forms. Emotion may strengthen it. Repetition may help it. But none of that is the end of the story. Once the day is over, the brain still has work to do. It has to decide what to keep in stronger form, what to connect with older knowledge, what to compress into gist, and what to let fade into the enormous background of things once lived but no longer needed in clear detail. Night is one of the places where that decision becomes more visible, even though the process itself remains mostly hidden from awareness. People sometimes speak as if the brain stores memories the moment they happen and then simply leaves them there. But the truth is more dynamic. The early memory trace is unstable. It needs support. It needs biological reinforcement. It needs the kind of reorganization that sleep appears especially suited to provide. This is one reason a badly slept night can make the previous day feel thinner in memory. The experiences occurred, the traces were formed, but the system that helped stabilize and sort them did not operate under ideal conditions. The result is often subtle but real. The next day, details feel less accessible, names slip more easily, learning holds less firmly. It is as though the day never quite settled into place. To understand why, it helps to consider what sleep is doing beyond simple unconsciousness. Sleep is not one uniform state. It shifts through stages, and those stages appear to support different aspects of memory processing. During slow-wave sleep, the deeper phases of non-REM sleep, the brain seems especially involved in consolidating certain forms of declarative memory, the kind that includes facts and events. During REM sleep, the vivid dream-rich phase, other kinds of emotional and associative processing appear especially active. The exact divisions are still being studied, but broadly speaking, sleep is a time when memory is not switched off. It is being worked on. One of the most fascinating ideas in memory research is that the sleeping brain replays patterns of activity linked to waking experience. Something from the day, a route, a learned task, a word list, a sequence, may be echoed again during sleep in compressed neural form. This replay appears to help strengthen connections and integrate new information into existing networks. It is as if the brain is quietly reviewing the day's material, saying not with words but with electrical patterns, "This belongs, this connects, this should remain more available tomorrow than it was tonight." But that same review also implies selection. Not everything is replayed. Not everything is consolidated equally. Sleep does not lovingly preserve each passing moment like an archivist in white gloves. It prioritizes. Emotional salience matters. Relevance to future goals seems to matter. Novelty matters. Repetition matters. A trivial detail noticed once under distraction may receive no special support at all. A concept studied with care, a conversation charged with feeling, a task likely to be useful tomorrow, these stand a better chance. Sleep helps keep what the brain judges worth the cost. This means that one of the reasons you forget so much is that sleep is not neutral. It is not merely a passive pause during which memories either survive by luck or disappear by neglect. It is part of the mechanism that decides. The day sends up a vast number of small traces, and the sleeping brain cannot possibly strengthen them all. So it chooses, guided by systems built for efficiency, adaptation, and survival rather than sentiment. The result is that by morning, the day has already been edited. This can sound a little cold, but there is also something deeply sensible about it. Imagine if every day were consolidated in full detail. Every overheard phrase in the supermarket, every meaningless notification, every passing face on the train, every half-formed thought while brushing your teeth, every sentence in every low-stakes conversation. The burden would be extraordinary. Cognitive life would become crowded with residue. The ability to think clearly, generalize, and focus on what matters now would suffer. Sleep selectivity protects you from that. It keeps the mind from becoming a room filled with every object it has ever touched. There is also the question of synaptic balance. Throughout the waking day, the brain is constantly learning, responding, and changing. Connections are being strengthened all the time. If this strengthening simply accumulated without correction, the system could become noisy and inefficient. One influential idea is that sleep helps globally downscale synaptic strength, not erasing what matters, but restoring balance so that the most important patterns stand out more clearly against a quieter background. In other words, sleep may help keep learning sustainable by trimming overall excess. This is not unlike tidying a desk by discarding loose scraps so that the key pages remain easy to find. That image helps make sense of why sleep and forgetting are so closely linked. Sleep is not only protecting memory, it is also making forgetting possible in a healthy way. It allows some traces to weaken, some to be ignored, some to be folded into broader summaries instead of preserved as individual episodes. This is one reason people can have a strong sense of what a day was about while retaining very little exact detail from it. The sleeping brain has already done some compression. It has extracted what seemed useful and reduced what did not. Emotion complicates this in interesting ways. Emotional experiences are often more likely to survive sleep with greater strength because they recruit systems that signal importance. A frightening moment, a painful conversation, a joyous surprise, a revelation. These may be more likely to be replayed, consolidated, or otherwise given priority. But sleep may also do something else with emotional memories. It appears to help separate, at least partly, the informational content of a memory from the immediate bodily charge around it. This is one reason healthy sleep can sometimes reduce the sharpness of emotional distress without erasing the fact of what happened. You still know the event occurred, but after sleep it may feel slightly less raw than it did at midnight. This softening is not magic, and it is not always enough, but it is an important part of how sleep supports emotional regulation. The brain does not simply keep or discard memories, it also adjusts how they are carried. A memory can remain while its emotional sting changes. Sleep contributes to this by helping reorganize memory across broader networks, placing the event in relation to other knowledge rather than leaving it as a hot, isolated fragment. In ideal circumstances, the night helps the mind say, "This happened, it mattered," but it does not need to arrive tomorrow with the exact same force. That may be why poor sleep can make the mind feel not only forgetful, but emotionally brittle. Without enough sleep, memories may consolidate less effectively, but emotions may also remain less processed. The next day, distress can feel sharper, attention more fragile, recall less reliable, and the distinction between what matters and what does not more difficult to maintain. A tired brain is not simply a slower brain. It is a brain whose editorial process has been interrupted. Too many traces remain messy, and too little has been properly organized. This becomes especially obvious in learning. Students know, often too late, that staying up all night cramming is a poor bargain. You can pour information in during the night, but without sleep the brain has less opportunity to stabilize and integrate it. What was studied may feel briefly familiar, yet remained fragile. By contrast, material learned and then followed by good sleep tends to hold better. This is not because sleep sprinkles memory dust over facts, while you dream of missing exams in your socks. It is because the brain uses sleep to perform real biological work on newly acquired information. The same principle applies far beyond school. Conversations, names, emotional insights, decisions, procedural skills, spatial layouts, all can benefit from sleep sorting. The next morning some things feel clearer, a route is easier to remember, a phrase comes back more naturally. A problem you struggled with the previous evening now seems more tractable. Sometimes people describe this as if the sleeping mind secretly solved the problem for them, and in some cases that is not far from the truth. Sleep can reorganize information in ways that strengthen patterns and reveal relationships not obvious during fatigued waking thought. But again, every gain here implies selection. The mind is not keeping all the raw material equally, it is extracting structure. The rough, scattered, unfinished pieces of waking life are being processed into something leaner and more usable. That means detail is often one of the casualties. Sleep may help preserve the fact that you had an important conversation while allowing many of its smaller surface elements to blur. It may strengthen the lesson without preserving the whole classroom. It may stabilize the emotional truth of a day while letting the exact order of events fade. This is not failure. It is one of the ways memory becomes functional. Dreaming adds another curious layer. Dreams themselves are often forgotten, which is fitting in a conversation about forgetting. People can wake with the sense that something vivid and elaborate just occurred, only to feel it dissolve within minutes. This happens partly because the conditions under which dream experiences are encoded into lasting waking memory are not ideal. Attention is different. Neurochemistry is different. The bridge into stable recall is fragile. As with waking life, experience alone does not guarantee retention. But dreams may still play a role in how the brain processes waking material, even when the dream content itself is lost. Some dreams seem to draw on recent fragments of life, old memories, unresolved concerns, emotional residues, bits of language, scraps of environment, and combine them in odd ways. Whether or not any particular dream has deep symbolic meaning, the broader fact remains that the sleeping brain is working with stored material in a dynamic fashion. It is not a silent archive, it is an active system, recombining, reinforcing, loosening and testing associations. What you remember of the dream may vanish, but some of the processing behind it may still have contributed to what the brain keeps and what it lets go. This is one reason sleep deprivation can be so cognitively disruptive. People who are chronically underslept often feel that life is passing through them in a thinner way. Details do not hold, names slide away, mood worsens, focus splinters. Days feel both crowded and poorly retained. That is not merely because they are tired in a general sense. It is because the brain is being deprived of one of its major opportunities to perform cleanup and consolidation. Without enough sleep, memory formation remains incomplete, and memory pruning becomes less effective. The mind keeps losing what it meant to keep, and dragging forward what it meant to sort. There is a striking humility in this. So much of what you think of as your remembered life depends not only on what happened, and not only on what you paid attention to, but on whether you later slept well enough for the brain to do its work. Memory is not a purely intellectual achievement. It is biological, embodied, vulnerable to rhythms of rest and disruption. A mind cannot store life well if the organism around it is not allowed the basic conditions under which storing becomes possible. This helps explain why certain periods of life, especially those defined by poor sleep, can later feel strangely unreal or thinned out. New parenthood, intense caregiving, illness, grief, burnout, travel across time zones, exam periods, night shift work, all can interfere with sleep in ways that also interfere with memory. The result may be a season of life that was deeply lived and highly consequential yet patchy in recall. People sometimes feel guilty or unsettled about this, as though they failed to appreciate the period enough to remember it properly. But often the problem is not appreciation. It is physiology. The traces did not receive the nighttime support they needed. At the same time, sleep is not a perfect librarian. It does not always choose wisely by human standards. It may preserve a humiliating comment more faithfully than a quiet kindness. It may strengthen a worry because the worry was emotionally charged, even if it was not useful. It may help fix into memory an awkward social misstep while allowing an ordinary peaceful evening to collapse into haze. This is because the sleeping brain, like the waking brain, is not guided by your later values about what ought to have mattered most. It is guided by salience, emotional intensity, novelty, and expected utility in a more biological sense. That can feel unfair, especially in hindsight. We may wish our brains had kept more of the tenderness and less of the shame, more of the daily love and less of the one-cutting remark. But memory is not moral. It is practical, and practicality can seem rude. This sleeping brain preserves what it has reason to treat as significant, and significance is often defined through ancient systems concerned with danger, reward, and adaptation. So yes, some painful things survive the night more robustly than they deserve. That too is part of the complicated relationship between sleep and forgetting. Still, it is important not to miss the broader gift. Sleep allows forgetting to happen in a way that protects clarity. It helps the mind avoid drowning in undigested detail. It allows patterns to emerge from clutter. It turns the day's chaos into something that can either become part of you or be safely released. The life you can remember tomorrow depends partly on what the brain quietly let go of tonight. There is also something almost merciful in the fact that each night offers a new round of sorting. Not everything from yesterday deserves equal presence today. Not every worry should remain at full brightness. Not every awkward thought needs to survive with equal clarity. Sleep gives the mind repeated chances to rebalance. Even when it does not solve everything, it often prevents the total accumulation of cognitive and emotional debris. In that sense, forgetting is woven into the rhythm of survival. You sleep, and the brain says, let us keep this, let us soften that, let us not carry every loose thread into the next morning. This rhythm also connects sleep to identity. The self you carry forward each day is not built from the full contents of yesterday, but from what sleep helped stabilize and what waking life continues to rehearse. The person who wakes is not merely yesterday's person resumed. They are yesterday's person after editing. Most of the time the edits are subtle enough to go unnoticed, but over months and years they shape who you become. What stays, what fades, what is linked to older knowledge, what is repeatedly strengthened, all of this influences the structure of your remembered life and therefore your sense of self. That is one reason the question of what sleep keeps and what it lets go is not merely technical, it is personal. It concerns how a human life gets turned into a knowable past. You do not carry forward all that you live. You carry forward what attention noticed, what emotion marked, what repetition reinforced, what sleep stabilized, and what later memory continued to revisit. The rest does not vanish in a dramatic puff of smoke. It thins, it disperses, it becomes part of the great background from which only a few things remain visible. And yet, those invisible parts still mattered. A day you barely remember may still have shaped your mood, your body, your relationships, your understanding, your habits. Sleep may have let its details go while retaining its lesson, its tone, its effect on who you were becoming. That is one of the quiet mysteries of memory. Forgetting does not mean absence of influence. It often means that the influence has been distilled. The scene is gone. The trace of its meaning remains. So if night is one of memory's editors, it is also one of life's translators. It takes the day and all its messy particularity and turns it into something leaner, more patterned, more survivable. Some things are preserved in greater detail. Some are folded into broader knowledge. Some are left behind. And because this happens again and again, day after day, year after year, the life you remember is never the full life you lived. It is the life that survived attention, emotion, repetition, sleep, and all the strange biological decisions that turn experience into memory. Which brings us very near the final question hiding beneath all the others. If so much is lost, softened, compressed, rewritten, and released, then what is it exactly that remains of a life? If you forget most of your days, most of your details, most of the passing texture that once seemed to make up reality itself, what are you actually carrying forward when you call it your past? There is something a little unsettling about saying it plainly. If you forget most of your life, then what exactly are you made of? Not in the biological sense, not bones and blood and neurons and the quiet chemistry that carries you from one day to the next, but in the human sense, in the sense of self, in the sense of the story you feel you are living. If the vast majority of your ordinary days dissolve, if details fade, if conversations blur, if whole years collapse into a handful of surviving scenes and a general feeling, then what remains when memory has done all its trimming? What is left after attention has missed so much, after sleep has sorted and discarded, after emotion has preserved only a few sharp points, after time has compressed one season into another, and the mind has quietly rewritten the past into something smoother than it ever was while you were inside it? It is a difficult question, partly because it presses against an old hope many people carry without saying so. We hope, in some small way, that memory is what saves our lives from vanishing. We hope that even if time moves on, the mind will preserve enough of what mattered to make the whole thing feel held. And memory does preserve something. It truly does. But by now we have wandered far enough through its workings to know that it is not preserving life in the way most people imagine. It is not keeping all the mornings and streets and voices and rooms in a complete internal museum. It is not storing every version of you who once existed. It is not carrying the whole thing forward frame by frame, and yet you are still here. You still feel like someone with a past. You still carry continuity. You still know, in a deep and lived sense, that you have been becoming yourself for a long time. That means the thing that remains cannot simply be the collection of remembered scenes. It has to be something larger, quieter, and more structural than that. Part of what remains is pattern, not the neat kind on wallpaper or kitchen tiles, but the pattern of a life slowly teaching a nervous system what to expect from the world. You may not remember each separate kindness that made you trust someone, but trust can remain. You may not remember each evening of calm in a childhood home, but the body may still carry some knowledge of safety. You may not remember the exact days that taught you caution, or humour, or patience, or fear, or resilience, but the repeated shape of those experiences can remain long after the individual episodes are gone. In that sense, much of your life survives not as memory you can narrate, but as memory you can live from. That is an important distinction. There are things you remember by telling, and things you remember by being. The first kind can be spoken. It can be turned into anecdotes, timelines, explanations, and stories. The second kind is quieter. It shows up in how quickly you relax around certain people, how easily you flinch at certain tones, how you approach love, how you move through conflict, what feels familiar, what feels dangerous, what feels possible, what feels ordinary, what feels like home. These are not always things you can trace back to single moments. Often they are the accumulated result of hundreds or thousands of small moments, most of which are gone from conscious recall. The episodes disappeared, the patterns stayed. This means a life can remain deeply present in a person even when it is no longer richly available as narrative. The past is not only what you can summon on command, it is also what has shaped the way you stand in the present. Every repeated experience leaves some kind of mark, even if the mark is not a vivid memory. A routine may vanish in detail while leaving behind skill. A relationship may blur in sequence while leaving behind expectation. A period of struggle may collapse into summary while leaving behind caution, endurance, tenderness, or fatigue. In this way, forgetting is not always the opposite of keeping. Sometimes it is the form in which life is kept most deeply. There is something almost comforting in that, because it means the loss of detail is not the same as the loss of significance. A mother may not remember most of the ordinary days of her child's early years in any precise way, yet those years remain in her posture toward the child, in her rhythms of care, in the body knowledge of what it was to be needed at all hours. A person may not remember every quiet conversation with a friend who later died, yet the friendship may remain in their sense of humour, their standards for warmth, their way of listening, the little phrases they still use without noticing. We often imagine that what is forgotten is gone, but life is more complicated than that. Forgotten moments can remain active in us without remaining visible to us. Another thing that remains is emotional truth, though even this is imperfect and sometimes distorted. You may lose the exact wording of an event, but keep its emotional weather. You may no longer know what day it happened on, or what shirt you were wearing, or who entered the room first, but you may still know, with a kind of bodily certainty, that this was the time you felt abandoned, or chosen, or ashamed, or relieved, or understood. Memory is poor at preserving total accuracy. It is often much better at preserving what an experience meant to the organism living through it. That meaning may later change, of course. A moment once understood as failure may later be seen as survival. A period once understood as ordinary may later be recognized as happy. But the mind does carry forward the emotional imprint of what life has done. This is one reason certain periods of life continue to matter, even when they have become hard to describe. You do not need a perfect account of adolescence to know that it shaped your sense of self. You do not need to recall each detail of a grief to know that it divided time into before and after. You do not need to reconstruct every day of a long illness to know that it altered your relationship with your body. What remains is not always the scene. Sometimes it is the change, and perhaps change is one of the deepest answers to the question. If you forget most of life, what remains? One answer is this: what remains is what life changed in you. Not always in dramatic ways, not always in ways you admire, but every stretch of living leaves adjustments behind. Some are visible and chosen, others are subtle and involuntary. The way you interpret silence, the speed at which you trust, the things you notice first in a room, the sort of apologies that move you, the kinds of future you can imagine, the places where your mind goes when it is tired, the ways you protect yourself, the ways you offer comfort. These are not random. They are shaped by 1,000 experiences, many of them forgotten in detail, all of them still working quietly in the architecture of the self. That word architecture may be useful here. A building does not display every hammer strike that made it. It does not preserve each lifted beam in visible form, yet those vanished actions are in it. They remain as structure. A human life is similar. You do not walk around carrying every event as a separate object. You carry the shape they left behind. Some days were bricks, some were scaffolding, some were weather, some were repairs, some were damage, some were windows opened by chance. Most are no longer visible in themselves, but they are there in the structure. Of course, this is not the whole answer, because people do not live only as structures. We live as storytellers too. We need some explicit memory, some scenes, some names, some places, some turning points, in order to feel that our lives belong to us in a human way. And those surviving fragments matter enormously. A few memories can carry astonishing weight. The look in a hospital corridor, a bicycle in summer, a phone call at dusk, the smell of a house now gone, a sentence someone said when you most needed it, a train station goodbye, a hand on your shoulder, a snowy morning from childhood. These scenes survive not because they are the only things that mattered, but because the mind sometimes chooses certain moments to stand for much more than themselves. A single memory can become the vessel for an era. This is one reason people often return to the same memories over and over. Not because the rest of life was empty, but because these few surviving moments act as anchors. They allow us to touch larger stretches of time through one preserved point. They are like knots in a rope. The rope is much longer than the knots, but the knots are what the hand can hold. Through them, the larger length becomes graspable. So what remains of a life is partly these anchor points, the preserved scenes around which broader identity and emotional truth gather. But even here there is a caution worth making. What remains is not always what was objectively most important. Memory is selective in ways that can feel unfair. It keeps some embarrassments too well. It lets some tenderness blur too quickly. It preserves a cutting remark while allowing years of ordinary affection to collapse into atmosphere. It may leave you with a sharp image of one painful afternoon, and almost nothing of 100 gentle evenings. This does not mean the painful afternoon mattered more. It means memory was shaped by emotion, attention, and salience, rather than by your later wisdom about what deserved to be saved. So the question of what remains cannot be answered as if memory were a fair judge. It is not fair. It is biological. That can sound bleak, but it also opens another way of thinking. If memory does not fairly preserve a life, then perhaps the worth of a life cannot depend only on what memory keeps. This matters. It means that forgotten days were not wasted because they are forgotten. A quiet afternoon with someone you loved does not lose its value, because you can no longer reconstruct it in detail. A year of honest work does not become less real because it compressed into a few broad impressions. A season of ordinary care, meals cooked, errands done, blankets folded, worries shared, jokes exchanged, does not become meaningless because the mind kept little of it as scene-based memory. Life does not need to remain vividly retrievable in order to have mattered while it was being lived. This is one of the gentlest truths hidden inside forgetting. We often judge the worth of experience by how memorable it becomes, but many of the most important parts of life are not spectacular enough to survive in sharp recollection. They are repetitive, ordinary, woven into habit. They do not announce themselves as destiny or revelation. They simply occur again and again, shaping a person slowly. The meals with family that were never photographed, the countless reassuring touches, the ordinary walks, the small acts of keeping a household together, the days of steady practice at some skill, the repeated showing up. These are easy for memory to compress and difficult for culture to praise because they do not always look dramatic, yet they may be the true substance of a life. In that sense, what remains is not only what you remember, but what you became through what you no longer remember. That may be one of the most human answers possible. You are not simply a curator of old scenes. You're the current form of countless lived influences, many visible, many hidden. The self is partly explicit recollection, yes, but also accumulated learning, changed habits, emotional tone, bodily expectation, language, style of attention, and the quiet internalized effects of everything life did to you and everything you did in response. There is also the matter of relation. A life does not remain only inside one mind. Parts of it continue in other people, in their memories certainly, though those are fragile too, but also in their behavior, their speech, their sense of what is normal, their thresholds for kindness, their humor, their fears, their loves. A parent forgets most of the hours spent with a child, but the child carries the effect. A friend forgets most of the conversations, but some phrase or way of seeing the world is passed along. A teacher forgets most of the classes taught, but students carry certain sentences for years. We live into one another more than memory alone can account for. So when we ask what remains of a life, the answer cannot be only what remains inside the individual mind. Some of what remains is distributed, woven outward into other nervous systems, other habits, other futures. This can make forgetting seem less lonely. Your past is not held by you alone. It survives in photographs, in family stories, in places, in objects, in shared jokes, in routines others learned from you, in the changed course of another person's life. Even when your own recall grows thin, the life was not contained entirely within the boundaries of your memory. This does not defeat loss, of course. It does not give back the vanished details, but it widens the meaning of what it is for a life to remain. And perhaps there is one more answer still, one that is simpler than the others. If you forget most of life, what remains? This remains. The fact that it was lived. That may sound almost too obvious, but it matters more than it first appears to. A day does not become unreal because it is no longer retrievable. A season does not become valueless because memory compressed it. A childhood room existed even if its exact dimensions are gone. A conversation mattered even if its words have dissolved. An ordinary Tuesday with someone you loved was still a real Tuesday in the world, full of breath and light and sound and presence, even if all that can now be reached of it is the faintest outline. Human beings often suffer because we confuse memory with reality. We imagine that what is forgotten has somehow slipped beneath the threshold of significance. But memory is not the court that decides whether life counted. It is only one of the ways life remains available afterward. Reality does not wait for recollection to justify itself. You were there. The day happened. It entered the stream of causes and consequences. It changed bodies, moods, relationships, futures. It was part of the real texture of the world, whether or not it stayed in your mind in rich detail. There is something peaceful in that if you let it settle for a moment. It means you do not have to remember perfectly in order to have lived truly. It means the forgotten portions of your life were not thrown away just because consciousness cannot now replay them. They are in the structure of the present, in the person you became, in the people you touched, in the emotional knowledge you carry, in the habits you formed, in the roads you no longer need to think about to walk. What remains is not everything, but it is also not nothing. It is less visible and more pervasive than that. So perhaps the quiet thought before sleep is this. You do forget most of your life. You forget the textures, the exact light, the passing words, the ordinary hours that once seemed too ordinary to lose. You forget more than you would choose. The mind keeps only fragments, summaries, patterns, and a handful of bright scenes. But what remains is still immense. What remains is the shape of a self, altered by living. What remains is the emotional truth of what mattered. What remains is the skill, the caution, the tenderness, the endurance, the longing, the humour, the way your body learned the world. What remains is the mark you left in others and the marks they left in you. What remains is the fact that your life was not merely stored, it was enacted. And maybe that's enough. Not enough to cancel the sadness of forgetting, because some sadness belongs there and should. not enough to stop a person from wishing they could hold more of the vanished faces and rooms and voices, but enough to loosen the fear that a life disappears just because memory cannot hold it whole. It does not disappear. It changes form. It becomes less like a gallery and more like a landscape you have already crossed, one that is now in your stride, your balance, your direction, your scars, your comfort, your instincts, your way of noticing the sky. The road is not behind you as a set of perfect images. It is behind you as the reason you walk the way you do now. And with that, the question becomes gentler. Not how do I keep everything? Because you cannot. Not how do I defeat forgetting? Because forgetting belongs to being human. But perhaps how do I trust that what truly mattered can remain, even when it no longer appears in perfect detail? The answer may be that it already has remained, in more forms than memory alone knows how to name, and that somewhere between the scenes you can still recall and the countless ones you cannot, the whole of a life has been quietly turning itself into you, and it goes on doing that even now.